The ancient world does not unfold as a complete narrative. It survives in fragments, buried cities, displaced artifacts, and knowledge that no longer fully translates. What we see today is not the past itself, but a reconstruction built from incomplete evidence. Entire civilizations appear already complex, with organized systems and advanced structures, yet without a clear origin. And just as suddenly, many of them vanish, leaving behind gaps that cannot be easily explained. The deeper we examine, the less continuous history becomes. Instead of a smooth progression, the ancient world reveals interruptions, missing links, and unresolved transitions. Until those gaps are understood, history remains not a finished story but an incomplete map. Old Dongola stands as a contradiction carved into the edge of the Nile. For centuries, it functioned as the political and religious center of the Nubian kingdom of Makuria, one of the most resilient Christian states in medieval Africa. Its position was strategic, its structures durable, and its influence documented in both Arabic and Byzantine sources. Yet unlike cities that ended in fire, conquest, or disaster, Old Dongola did not collapse in a single moment. It faded. The problem is not that it disappeared. The problem is that the evidence does not clearly explain why. Located along a vital stretch of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, Old Dongola controlled a corridor linking sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt and the Mediterranean world. Historical accounts from Arab geographers describe Makuria as a powerful and stable kingdom between the 7th and 13th centuries. Written records suggest long-term diplomatic relations with Islamic Egypt, including the Bakht Treaty, which maintained relative peace for centuries. From a geopolitical perspective, this location should have guaranteed continuity. River access meant water, agriculture, and trade. Natural desert barriers offered defense. Unlike marginal settlements, Dongola had every structural advantage required for survival. And yet, by the late medieval period, its prominence had diminished without a clearly identifiable rupture. Modern excavations, particularly those led by Polish archaeological missions since the 20th century, have revealed a city built in phases rather than destroyed and rebuilt. Churches were not razed but repurposed. One of the most significant findings is the transformation of a large cathedral complex into a mosque, likely around the 14th century. This transition lacks the expected archaeological signatures of conflict. There are no widespread burn layers, no mass destruction horizons, and no abrupt abandonment strata. Instead, the record shows continuity with modification. Walls were reused, foundations were preserved, urban space adapted, rather than collapsed. In comparison, sites like Pompeii present a clear destruction layer dated to 79 CE, while Angkor exhibits hydraulic system failures tied to environmental stress. Old Dongola shows neither pattern in a definitive form. The most technically puzzling aspect of Old Dongola lies in its construction. The majority of its buildings were made from mud brick, sun-dried bricks composed primarily of Nile silt, clay, water, and organic temper such as straw. By conventional engineering standards, this material is considered vulnerable. It is susceptible to erosion from wind, dissolution from water, and structural weakening under temperature fluctuations. Yet in Dongola, mud brick structures have endured for centuries in an environment defined by extremes. Daytime temperatures in the region regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius, while seasonal winds transport abrasive sand capable of gradually eroding exposed surfaces. Under such conditions, untreated mud brick architecture typically degrades within decades unless continuously maintained. Scientific analysis of surviving walls suggests several factors contributing to their durability. First, The composition of Nile silt includes fine particles that, when compacted and dried, create a dense matrix with relatively low permeability. This reduces water infiltration, one of the primary causes of structural decay. Second, the addition of organic fibers such as straw increases tensile strength and limits cracking during drying cycles. Third, wall thickness plays a critical role. In Dongola, many structures exceed 1 meter in thickness, providing thermal mass that stabilizes internal temperatures and reduces stress from expansion and contraction. However, these explanations do not fully resolve the anomaly. Comparable mud brick sites across North Africa and the Middle East, such as rural settlements in Upper Egypt, show significantly higher rates of erosion and collapse when abandoned. Even in relatively dry environments, wind-driven abrasion gradually reduces wall height and structural integrity. In Dongola, preservation appears uneven but notably resilient in key areas, suggesting that construction techniques may have included additional, less understood optimizations. Some researchers propose the use of surface treatments or plasters that reduced exposure to direct erosion. Others point to urban layout, where clustered buildings shielded each other from prevailing winds. There is also the possibility that microtopography, slight Ittifar differences in terrain, redirected water flow during rare but intense rainfall events, minimizing damage. When compared to stone-built cities like Petra, where durability is expected due to the hardness of the material, Dongola presents a different type of engineering logic. It achieves longevity not through material strength alone, but through system-level adaptation, material composition, structural geometry, and environmental interaction working together. The unresolved question is whether this resilience was the result of deliberate optimization or accumulated empirical knowledge refined over generations. There is no surviving technical manual, no written explanation of construction standards. The outcome, however, indicates a level of environmental understanding that exceeds what is typically attributed to mud brick architecture of the period. Old Dongola was once a major center of Christian Nubia, with richly decorated churches featuring wall paintings that demonstrate connections to Byzantine artistic traditions. Over time, these spaces were altered to accommodate Islamic practices. The architectural evidence suggests adaptation rather than eradication. This gradual transition challenges assumptions about religious change in medieval contexts, where conversion is often associated with conflict or forced replacement. In Dongola, the process appears more complex. It implies either a slow demographic shift, sustained coexistence, or political restructuring that did not prioritize symbolic destruction. By the 15th century, Old Dongola had lost its status as a major political center. Archaeological evidence indicates reduced occupation intensity rather than sudden abandonment. Population decline appears incremental. Several hypotheses attempt to explain this pattern. Climate change may have altered Nile flood cycles, affecting agriculture. Trade routes could have shifted, reducing economic relevance. Internal political fragmentation may have weakened centralized authority. Yet none of these factors alone provides a complete explanation. Unlike Angkor, where sediment cores and hydraulic studies demonstrate systemic environmental stress, Dongola lacks a single dominant variable. Its decline is diffuse, distributed across multiple possible causes without a definitive primary driver. The broader significance of Old Dongola lies in its resistance to simple classification. It does not align with the standard models of urban collapse, catastrophic destruction, environmental failure, or abrupt conquest. Instead, it represents a different pattern: continuity followed by gradual dissolution. This pattern raises a larger issue in archaeological interpretation. If a major city can decline without leaving a clear causal signature, How many other sites might be misinterpreted due to the absence of dramatic evidence? The lack of a clear endpoint is itself a form of data, one that challenges assumptions about how civilizations end. If a powerful capital like Old Dongola could slowly fade without war, disaster, or a clear cause, then what does that say about how civilizations truly disappear, and how many others might have vanished the same way without leaving an answer? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Ancient timelines are built on assumptions, layers of evidence arranged into a sequence that feels logical. Humans settle, agriculture develops, societies organize, and only then do complex structures emerge. Boncuklu Tarla disrupts that sequence. Located in southeastern Turkey, near Mardin province, this archaeological site dates back to approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, placing it firmly within the pre-pottery Neolithic period. What makes it significant is not just its age, but what exists at that age: organized architecture, communal planning, and indications of systems that should not yet exist according to conventional models. Excavations that began in the early 21st century revealed a settlement composed of circular stone structures, carefully arranged rather than randomly distributed. These are not temporary shelters. The walls are constructed from shaped stones fitted together with consistency, forming stable enclosures that have endured for millennia. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the site places its primary occupation around the 10th millennium BCE, aligning it chronologically with sites such as Göbekli Tepe. However, while Göbekli Tepe is widely interpreted as a ritual center with monumental pillars, Boncuklu Tarla presents a more complex hybrid. It appears to combine habitation with structured communal spaces, suggesting a level of social organization that remains difficult to define. One of the most striking discoveries at Boncuklu Tarla is the presence of a drainage system constructed from stone channels. These channels are not random gaps between rocks. They are deliberately arranged pathways designed to control the flow of water. In later civilizations, such as those of Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley drainage systems, are associated with urban planning, population density, and administrative control. Yet Boncuklu Tarla predates these civilizations by several thousand years. The existence of such infrastructure raises a direct question. What conditions required this level of environmental management so early in human history? Seasonal rainfall alone does not fully explain the effort invested in constructing these channels. Their presence implies foresight, repeated observation, and a shared understanding of cause and effect across the community. The spatial organization of the site reinforces this pattern. Structures are positioned in ways that suggest intentional planning rather than organic growth. Certain buildings appear to serve functions beyond simple shelter. Their internal layouts differ, and their placement within the settlement indicates a possible communal or ritual role. This duality, practical living spaces alongside specialized structures, mirrors patterns seen in later, more complex societies. Yet here it appears at a time when humanity is assumed to have been transitioning only recently from nomadic lifestyles. However, the most difficult aspect to reconcile is not the presence of architecture or infrastructure, it is the precision embedded within the tools and the craftsmanship itself. The inhabitants of Boncuklu Tarla operated without metal. Their technological toolkit consisted primarily of stone implements, flaked tools, ground stone axes, and rudimentary cutting instruments. Under such conditions, variability is expected. Edges should be uneven, cuts should deviate. Structures should reflect approximation rather than consistency. Instead, what archaeologists observe is a degree of regularity that exceeds what is strictly necessary for survival. Stone blocks used in wall construction exhibit repeated shaping patterns. While not perfectly uniform by modern standards, they fall within a narrow range of size and proportion. This suggests not only skill, but a shared method, an implicit standard. When multiple individuals produce similar results without written instructions or measuring devices, it implies the existence of transmitted knowledge that is both stable and replicable. Experimental archaeology provides a useful comparison. When modern researchers attempt to replicate Neolithic stone shaping using only period-appropriate tools, results often show significant variation unless extensive training is involved. Even then, maintaining consistent dimensions across multiple pieces requires time, coordination, and feedback mechanisms. This leads to a deeper question. Why aim for consistency beyond what is functionally required? A wall can stand with irregular stones. A shelter can exist without symmetry. Yet at Boncuklu Tarla, there is evidence of repeated geometric tendencies curvature maintained across circular structures, alignment between adjacent features, and the integration of drainage channels that follow predictable paths. These are not random outcomes. They are decisions. In engineering terms, precision is costly. It requires additional labor, time, and cognitive effort. In early human societies, where energy expenditure is closely tied to survival, unnecessary precision would be expected to be minimized. The fact that it is not minimized here suggests that precision served a purpose beyond immediate practicality. One possibility is structural stability. More regular stones fit together more effectively, distributing load and reducing points of weakness. Over long periods, such structures are more likely to endure, which may partially explain why Boncuklu Tarla remains intact today. However, structural necessity alone does not fully account for the observed patterns. The level of repeatability hints at something closer to a conceptual framework, an understanding of form that is applied consistently across the settlement. Comparisons with other Neolithic sites strengthen this anomaly. At Kampyr Tepe and Göbekli Tepe, carved pillars and symbolic motifs suggest ritual complexity, but they do not necessarily demonstrate the same integration of everyday construction with infrastructural planning. Boncuklu Tarla appears to bridge that gap. It is not purely symbolic, nor purely functional. It operates at an intersection where utility and intention overlap. Measurements taken from excavated sections indicate that wall thicknesses remain relatively consistent within individual structures, often varying by only a few centimeters. For a society without standardized measuring tools, this level of control is non-trivial. It implies either the use of informal measurement systems, body-based units, visual estimation refined through practice, or a form of apprenticeship where techniques are passed down with high fidelity. In both cases, the outcome is the same: a community capable of producing predictable results. The implications extend beyond craftsmanship. Precision at this scale suggests communication. Individuals must agree, implicitly or explicitly, on what constitutes a correct shape or size. This agreement forms the basis of coordination, and coordination is the foundation of organized society. Yet the archaeological record at Boncuklu Tarla does not show clear evidence of hierarchy. There are no monumental palaces, no obvious elite residences, no inscriptions indicating authority. The system appears to function without visible central control, raising the possibility of a decentralized model of organization that nonetheless achieves complex outcomes. This contradiction, high precision without clear hierarchy, remains unresolved. In later civilizations, complexity is typically accompanied by stratification. Here, the relationship is less clear. It suggests that the development of technical skill and the emergence of social hierarchy may not be as tightly linked as previously assumed. If a society without metal, writing, or formal hierarchy could still achieve this level of precision and organization, What exactly are we missing in our understanding of early human capability? Was Boncuklu Tarla the beginning of complex civilization, or evidence that something more advanced had already been lost? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Sarazm entered modern history not through design, but by accident. In 1976, a farmer working near the Zaravshan River uncovered fragments of pottery unlike anything known in the region. Archaeologists soon followed, and what began as a small anomaly expanded into one of the most significant prehistoric discoveries in Central Asia. Beneath the surface lay a settlement dating to approximately 3,500 to 3000 BCE, placing it firmly within the late Neolithic to early Chalcolithic transition. Yet even at this earlier stage, Sarazm did not resemble a primitive village. It appeared organized, structured, and unexpectedly advanced. Excavations conducted from the late 20th century into the early 21st century, led in part by archaeologist Abdullah Isakov, revealed a multi-layered settlement spanning several centuries. Each occupational layer added clarity, but also deepened the mystery. The earliest layers, dated to around 3500 BCE, revealed permanent architecture, rectangular mud brick structures, multi-room layouts, and clearly defined activity zones. Unlike typical Neolithic settlements, which often show irregular growth, Sarazm displayed signs of intentional planning. The settlement extended across an estimated 90 hectares, making it unusually large for its time. As excavations progressed into middle layers, evidence of craft specialization emerged. Stone tools became more refined, ceramic production showed stylistic consistency, and most notably, metallurgical activity appeared. Remains of furnaces, crucibles, and slag deposits indicated repeated, controlled processes rather than isolated experimentation. By the later phases, Sarazm had transformed into a hub of long-distance exchange. Archaeologists uncovered materials that could not have originated locally. Lapis lazuli traced to Badakhshan in present-day Afghanistan, carnelian beads associated with the Indus Valley civilization, and stylistic parallels with artifacts from Mesopotamia. These findings suggest that Sarazm was integrated into a network spanning hundreds, possibly thousands of kilometers. In most regions, the transition from village life to urban organization follows a gradual trajectory. Sites such as Çatalhöyük, dated to around 7000 BCE, show dense habitation but lack formal planning or clear administrative structure. Later, Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, emerging around 4000 BCE, demonstrate increasing complexity but only after millennia of incremental development. Sarazm disrupts this pattern. There is no clear evidence of earlier local settlements evolving into it. Instead, it appears almost fully formed, structured housing, specialized labor, and evidence of coordinated activity. This raises a fundamental question in archaeological theory whether urbanization can emerge independently in multiple regions, or whether knowledge transfer played a more significant role than previously assumed. Among all the anomalies at Sarazm, none is more debated than its metallurgical sophistication. Evidence from the site indicates that inhabitants were not merely experimenting with native copper, but engaging in systematic extraction and processing. Archaeologists have identified slag deposits, furnace remains, and crucibles capable of withstanding high temperatures, suggesting repeated exposure to heat levels exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius, the approximate threshold required for copper smelting. This is significant because metallurgy, particularly in its early stages, is typically characterized by trial and error development. At sites across Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, early copper use often appears sporadic, with inconsistent results and limited standardization. Yet at Sarazm, Tools exhibit uniform shapes and functional consistency, implying a degree of technical control that should not yet exist at this stage. Even more striking is the absence of a visible learning curve. There are no clear transitional phases showing gradual improvement in metallurgical techniques. Instead, the evidence suggests that knowledge was already established when it appeared at Sarazm. Comparatively, in regions like Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, early metallurgy emerges slowly between 5000 and 4000 BCE, often limited to cold hammered copper before advancing to smelting. Sarazm, however, appears to skip intermediate stages, presenting a system that is already operational. This leads to several unresolved possibilities. One is that metallurgical knowledge diffused rapidly across vast distances, reaching Central Asia earlier than expected. Another is that the origins of this knowledge lie in yet undiscovered sites, where the developmental phases remain hidden beneath unexplored terrain. A more complex interpretation suggests parallel innovation, multiple regions independently discovering similar techniques under comparable environmental pressures. Yet this does not fully explain the precision and repeatability observed at Sarazm. The metallurgy of Sarazm is not simply early, it is prematurely mature. The presence of non-local materials at Sarazm reinforces the idea that it was part of a broader system of exchange. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue metamorphic stone, highly valued in antiquity, is known to originate primarily from the Badakhshan region. Its appearance at Sarazm indicates trade routes extending at least several hundred kilometers. Carnelian beads, often associated with Indus Valley craftsmanship, suggest connections to a civilization located over 1,000 kilometers away. While direct trade cannot always be confirmed, the distribution of such materials implies a network of intermediary exchanges, linking distant regions into a shared economic system. This challenges earlier assumptions that early Central Asian communities were isolated. Instead, Sarazm may have functioned as a transitional hub, facilitating movement between the Iranian Plateau, South Asia, and the Eurasian steppe. Despite its apparent success, Sarazm was eventually abandoned. Archaeological layers show a gradual reduction in activity rather than sudden destruction. There is no definitive evidence of warfare, invasion, or catastrophic collapse. Environmental explanations remain the most widely accepted. Changes in river flow, soil exhaustion, or regional climate shifts may have undermined the settlement's sustainability. However, precise data remains limited, and no single factor fully accounts for the decline. What remains is a pattern seen in multiple ancient contexts, a complex society that reaches a peak of organization only to fade without clear explanation. Sarazm does not fit conventional models of development. It appears very early, yet already displays features of an advanced society-planned layout, labor specialization, metallurgy, and long-distance trade. While these traits usually emerge gradually over time, at Sarazm they appear almost simultaneously, suggesting a form of compressed development. This raises a critical question. Are current models incomplete, or are key stages still missing from the archaeological record? Sarazm is not just an ancient settlement, it is a direct challenge to the linear timeline we once believed. What do you think? Was Sarazm an independent leap in human development, or evidence of a lost chapter we haven't discovered yet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Small ceramic object, no larger than a human hand, sits behind glass in a museum. At first glance it appears simple, an animal-shaped vessel, something decorative, perhaps symbolic. But the longer it is observed, the less it behaves like a casual artifact. Its proportions are controlled, its surface is structured, and its markings follow patterns that resist randomness. It is not the scale that is unusual, it is the precision. In a time before writing, before standardized measurement, before industrial tools, this object appears as if it was designed with intent that exceeds what its era should comfortably allow. This is the so-called Vucedol Dove, created between roughly 3000 and 2500 BCE by the Vucedol culture. It is often described as a bird, but that description may be the first mistake. The artifact was uncovered near Vucedol, a settlement overlooking the Danube River. Archaeological evidence places this culture firmly within the Copper Age, a transitional period when metallurgy began to reshape human societies. Excavations in the region have revealed advanced copper smelting, ceramic production, and signs of social hierarchy. Radiocarbon dating of associated layers consistently places the culture between approximately 3000 and 2500 BCE, aligning it with other early complex societies in Europe. Yet unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Vucedol culture left behind no confirmed writing system. There are no tablets, no inscriptions that can be read, no surviving linguistic framework. And yet, paradoxically, objects like the Vucedol Dove suggest structured thinking, repetition, symbolism, and encoded design. This creates a contradiction, a society capable of consistent symbolic expression, but without a decipherable language. The object is traditionally labeled as a dove, but its morphology raises immediate doubts. The neck is thick, the head elongated, and the body disproportionately heavy. It lacks the anatomical balance of a real dove and instead resembles a hybrid between abstraction and observation. Some researchers have proposed that it may represent a bird of prey. Others suggest it is entirely symbolic, not intended to replicate any real species. The ambiguity matters. In archaeology, identification often begins with resemblance, but when resemblance fails, interpretation becomes unstable. If it is not a bird, then the entire framework used to understand it collapses. What remains is a form that is clearly intentional, yet not clearly representational. This is not uncommon in prehistoric art. Similar ambiguities appear in figurines from the Vinca culture, where human-like shapes merge with geometric abstraction. But the Vucedol Dove is different. It is not just stylized, it is structured. The surface of the object is covered with incised lines, arranged in repeating geometric patterns. These are not random scratches. Microscopic analysis of ceramic surfaces from the Vucedol site shows consistent engraving depth and spacing, indicating controlled tool use. The lines form bands, grids, and segmented areas, suggesting a system rather than ornamentation. Comparative studies have noted similarities between these patterns and early symbolic systems found across Southeast Europe. Some archaeologists have cautiously proposed that these markings could represent a form of proto-writing, a transitional stage between pure decoration and formal language. However, no direct translation exists, and no parallel text has been found to confirm this. The statistical repetition of certain motifs suggests intentional encoding. In modern terms, repetition reduces entropy, it implies information. But without a key, the information remains inaccessible. The object includes an opening, suggesting it functioned as a container. Residue analysis on similar Vucedol ceramics has identified traces of organic materials, possibly fermented liquids. This has led to the hypothesis that the vessel was used in ritual contexts, perhaps for pouring libations. However, the form complicates this interpretation. The vessel is not ergonomically efficient, its shape makes it unstable, difficult to clean, and impractical for repeated use. This indicates that function was not the primary constraint in its design. Instead, the object appears to prioritize symbolic form over practical utility. This aligns with ritual artifacts in many early societies, where objects are designed not for efficiency, but for meaning. But meaning requires a system, and the system here remains unknown. This is where the anomaly becomes most difficult to ignore. The Vucedol Dove was created using basic materials: clay, water, and fire. No evidence suggests the use of molds in its production. Instead, it was hand-shaped and then refined before firing. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate similar objects using period-accurate tools. The results consistently show that achieving such symmetry and consistency is possible, but only with a high degree of skill, repetition, and planning. Measurements of the artifact reveal proportional balance across its structure. The curvature of the body is controlled, the alignment of the engraved bands is consistent, and the thickness of the ceramic walls remains within a narrow range. These are not random outcomes. They indicate premeditated design. In modern manufacturing, precision is achieved through measurement systems and repeatable processes. In the Copper Age, such systems are not well documented. There are no rulers, no standardized units, no written instructions, and yet the artifact behaves as if such systems existed in some form. This paradox is not unique to Vucedol. Similar patterns appear in other ancient contexts. The stonework of early Neolithic sites shows alignment accuracy that suggests geometric planning. Ceramic traditions across Europe demonstrate consistency in form that implies shared standards. But in each case, the tools and documentation do not fully explain the results. One possible explanation is cognitive rather than technological. Skilled artisans may have internalized measurement through practice, using body-based units or visual calibration. Over time, this could produce consistency without formal standardization. However, this does not fully account for the complexity of the engraved patterns, which require not just repetition, but spatial planning. Another possibility is that we are underestimating the sophistication of these societies. The absence of preserved tools or written records does not necessarily indicate their absence in reality. Organic materials decay. Knowledge can be transmitted orally. Systems can exist without leaving durable traces. What remains is the artifact itself, a physical object that encodes decisions. Every line, every curve, every proportion reflects a choice. And the cumulative effect of those choices is a level of precision that appears disproportionate to the assumed capabilities of its creators. The Vucedol culture was not isolated. Trade networks connected it to broader European regions, and metallurgical evidence suggests knowledge exchange. Yet despite this connectivity, its symbolic system did not evolve into a recognizable writing tradition, or at least none that survived. This creates a deeper question. If symbolic systems existed, why did they not persist? Why do we see fragments, patterns, motifs, structured designs, but no continuous record? One explanation is disruption. Environmental change, migration, or cultural replacement could have erased continuity. Another is that the system was never intended as writing in the modern sense. It may have functioned within a specific ritual or social context, meaningful only to those within the culture. In that case, the Vucedol Dove is not a message waiting to be decoded. It is a message that has already lost its audience. Modern interpretation relies on analogy. We compare unfamiliar objects to known categories: bird, vessel, decoration. But this approach assumes that ancient creators operated within frameworks similar to ours. What if they did not? If the form is not a bird, the pattern's not decoration, and the function not practical, then the object exists outside our categories. It becomes something else entirely, an artifact of a conceptual system that no longer exists. This is the central problem. Not that the Vucedol Dove is mysterious, but that our methods of understanding may be insufficient. If ancient artifacts like the Vucedol Dove can be completely misinterpreted, how many other mysteries in history do you think we're still getting wrong, without realizing it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Jarqo'ton did not emerge from the ground as a dramatic, singular discovery. It began with fragments, scattered pottery, faint outlines of walls and subtle anomalies in the soil recorded during Soviet-era surveys in southern Uzbekistan in the 1970s. At first, it seemed like just another minor Bronze Age settlement, but as excavation expanded, the scale shifted dramatically. What lay beneath was not a village, but a structured urban centre covering dozens of hectares, dated roughly between 1500 and 1300 BCE, associated with the Sapali culture. And from that moment, the site began to contradict expectations. Conventional models of Bronze Age development suggest that complex urban systems emerged in a limited number of core regions, primarily Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley Civilization, and the Nile Valley. Central Asia, by contrast, has often been framed as a transitional zone dominated by pastoral or semi-nomadic groups. Jarqo'ton challenges that assumption. Excavations reveal defensive walls, organized residential sectors, and a central complex that appears to serve ritual or administrative functions. The layout suggests planning rather than organic growth. To put this into perspective, cities like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, dated to around 2600 BCE, exhibit grid-based planning and drainage systems. Jarqo'ton, though later by nearly 1,000 years, appears in a region where such planning was not expected at all. This raises a critical question. Was urbanization in Central Asia independently developed, or was it influenced by distant civilizations through networks we still cannot fully trace? Perhaps the most unsettling contradiction at Jarqo'ton lies not in what was built, but in how it has survived. The city was constructed primarily from mud brick, an unbaked mixture of clay, water, and organic material. By all conventional engineering standards, mud brick is among the least durable building materials. In environments with temperature fluctuation, wind erosion, and seasonal moisture, such structures degrade rapidly, often within decades or centuries at most without continuous maintenance. And yet, at Jarqo'ton, large portions of walls, foundations, and architectural outlines remain identifiable after more than 3,000 years. This is not entirely unique, but the degree of preservation is unusual. For comparison, mud brick architecture in Mesopotamia often survives only as low mounds, heavily eroded and difficult to reconstruct without extensive interpretation. Even in relatively stable desert environments like parts of Egypt, mud brick structures typically require protective conditions, burial under sand, minimal rainfall, or deliberate conservation to remain intact over millennia. Jarqo'ton presents a more complex case. The site has been exposed, subject to environmental stress, yet still retains structural clarity. This leads to several unresolved possibilities. One hypothesis suggests advanced preparation techniques, specific ratios of clay to organic binders, controlled drying methods, or even unknown additives that increase durability. However, chemical analyses so far have not identified any dramatically unusual composition. Another possibility is environmental, that ancient climatic conditions in the region were significantly different, perhaps drier or more stable, reducing long-term erosion. Paleoclimate studies do indicate shifts in Central Asian climate over the past several thousand years, but not at a scale that fully explains the preservation seen here. A third, more subtle explanation His architectural intelligence designed choices that minimized exposure, such as wall thickness, orientation relative to prevailing winds, or structural layering that slowed degradation. In other words, the material itself may be simple, but the way it was used could reflect a level of environmental adaptation that we are only beginning to understand. Still, none of these explanations fully resolves the contradiction. Mud brick should not last this long, under these conditions, with this level of clarity. And yet, at Jarqo'ton, it does. Among the most debated features of Jarqo'ton is its ritual complex, where archaeologists have identified structures interpreted as fire altars. These installations bear a conceptual resemblance to later practices associated with Zoroastrianism, in which fire plays a central symbolic role. The problem is chronological. Zoroastrianism, as a formalized religious system, is generally dated to the early 1st millennium BCE, although its origins may extend earlier. Jarqo'ton predates this by several centuries. If the interpretation is correct, it suggests that elements of fire-centered ritual practice existed long before they were codified into a structured religion. Alternatively, the resemblance may be superficial, similar forms arising independently in different cultural contexts. Without written records, the function of these structures remains speculative, but their presence indicates that Jarqo'ton was not merely a settlement. It was a place where symbolic or ritual behavior was spatially organized and architecturally embedded. Artifacts recovered from Jarqo'ton complicate its isolation. Pottery styles, beads, and certain material forms show parallels with regions far beyond Central Asia, including the Indus Valley Civilization and areas connected to Mesopotamia. This suggests participation in broader exchange networks, possibly linked to what archaeologists describe as the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, a system of interconnected settlements spanning parts of modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan. However, unlike Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, where written records and well-defined trade routes provide context, Jarqo'ton exists in relative silence. There are no inscriptions, no administrative tablets, no direct evidence of organized long-distance trade infrastructure. The implication is paradoxical. Material evidence points to connectivity, but the mechanisms of that connectivity remain invisible. Equally puzzling is how Jarqo'ton ended. Archaeological layers do not show signs of violent destruction, no widespread burning, no mass casualties, no abrupt collapse. Instead, the evidence suggests gradual abandonment. This pattern aligns with broader regional transitions during the Late Bronze Age, when climatic shifts, changes in water availability, or evolving trade dynamics may have altered settlement viability. Yet in Jarqo'ton, the data is incomplete. There is no single event, no clear tipping point, only a slow fading from occupation into silence. Jarqo'ton is not the largest or most advanced city, but it does not align with any established historical model. It introduces urban planning in a region where it was not expected, preserves mud brick architecture beyond normal limits, suggests ritual systems earlier than recorded history, and shows signs of trade without leaving clear traces. Then it disappears without a specific cause. Jarqo'ton does not break history, it exposes its gaps. What do you think Jarqo'ton really represents, an isolated anomaly, or evidence of a forgotten system of early civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Afrasiab is the ancient core of Samarkand, a site whose buried layers reveal a level of technical sophistication that does not fully align with conventional timelines of urban development in Central Asia. What emerges from its ruins is not just a lost city, but a system, engineered with precision, maintained over centuries, and ultimately erased in a way that still raises unresolved questions. The discovery of Afrasiab was not a single breakthrough moment, but a gradual unveiling. By the late 19th century, Russian archaeologists began systematic excavations on the northeastern edge of modern Samarkand, uncovering walls, pottery, and urban remains buried beneath layers of earth. What initially appeared to be scattered ruins soon revealed a continuous settlement history, stretching back to approximately the 8th century BCE. Stratigraphic analysis showed multiple occupation layers, in some areas exceeding several meters in depth. Each layer represented a different phase of construction, destruction, and rebuilding, suggesting not just longevity, but continuity of technical knowledge. Unlike many ancient sites that show abrupt cultural breaks, Afrasiab appeared to evolve, refine, and adapt over time. Afrasiab existed in a semi-arid zone, where sustaining a large population required more than access to water, it required control. Excavations revealed an intricate network of canals, reservoirs, and distribution systems, many of which were aligned with subtle elevation gradients. Some channels maintained a consistent slope over long distances, minimizing stagnation and maximizing flow efficiency. Modern hydraulic engineering recognizes that even a gradient deviation of less than 1% can significantly alter water velocity and sediment buildup. The fact that ancient engineers achieved such consistency without modern instruments suggests either highly refined surveying techniques or long-term empirical calibration. Comparisons with other ancient hydraulic systems, such as those in Petra or the Karnat systems of Persia, show parallels in concept, but Afrasiab's integration into a dense urban grid appears unusually cohesive. This was not an add-on system, it was embedded into the city's design from the beginning. The layout of Afrasiab suggests more than organic growth. Defensive walls, administrative centers, residential clusters, and ceremonial spaces were arranged in a structured hierarchy. Roads connected directly to water distribution points, and population density appears to have been managed relative to resource access. Some alignments of streets and structures have been proposed to correspond with environmental factors such as prevailing winds or solar exposure. While these interpretations remain debated, the consistency of orientation across different construction phases indicates intentional planning. In comparison, many early urban centers, such as those in Mesopotamia, often show irregular expansion patterns, shaped by immediate needs rather than long-term planning. Afrasiab, by contrast, gives the impression of a city designed with foresight, as if its builders were working within a conceptual framework that has not been fully reconstructed. Among all discoveries, the Afrasiab murals stand as the most technically and conceptually unsettling. Dating to the 7th century CE, these wall paintings depict diplomatic scenes involving Sogdian rulers and foreign envoys from regions including China and Persia. At first glance, they appear to be historical artwork, but closer analysis reveals anomalies that challenge assumptions about ancient artistic capability. The pigments themselves are remarkably well preserved. After more than 13 centuries, many sections retain vivid blues, reds, and yellows, with minimal fading. Scientific analysis has identified mineral-based pigments such as lapis lazuli and iron oxides, but what remains unclear is the binding medium. The durability suggests the use of complex organic compounds or layered application techniques that enhanced adhesion and resistance to environmental degradation. In modern conservation science, preserving color stability over centuries requires precise control over pigment composition, substrate preparation, and environmental conditions. Yet the Afrasiab murals achieved this without controlled environments. Compared to Roman frescoes, many of which have degraded significantly over similar timescales, the Afrasiab paintings display an unusual resilience. Even more striking is the execution. The lines are consistently fine, with minimal variation in thickness, suggesting controlled application tools. Facial proportions remain stable across multiple figures, implying either measurement guidelines or advanced artistic training systems. The perspective, while not fully geometric in the Renaissance sense, shows an understanding of spatial layering and narrative sequencing. Microscopic analysis reveals layered paint application, where base tones were applied first, followed by finer detailing. This multi-stage process requires not only technical skill, but also planning each layer must anticipate the next. Errors would be difficult to correct, yet the murals show little evidence of major revisions. The question is not whether ancient artists were skilled. They clearly were. But whether the level of precision seen here implies tools or techniques that have not been preserved. No detailed records of brushes, measurement instruments, or pigment preparation methods have been definitively linked to the murals. What remains is the result, artwork that behaves, in terms of durability and consistency, closer to engineered material than simple paint. In this sense, the Afrasiab murals blur the boundary between art and technology. They represent a system of knowledge, chemical, procedural, and aesthetic that appears fully developed yet largely undocumented. Afrasiab's fortifications evolved over time, becoming thicker and more complex in response to external threats. Some sections include angled bastions and layered walls designed to absorb and redirect impact forces. This suggests an understanding of mechanical stress and attack dynamics. Comparatively, similar defensive adaptations can be observed in later medieval fortifications across Europe and the Middle East. However, the presence of such features in earlier phases at Afrasiab raises the possibility that these principles were understood and applied much earlier than commonly assumed. By the early 13th century, Afrasiab was largely abandoned following the Mongol invasions, yet archaeological evidence suggests that some systems may have already been failing. Sections of the water network show signs of blockage or disrepair. If the city depended on finely calibrated infrastructure, even minor disruptions could have triggered cascading failures. A breakdown in water supply would affect agriculture, sanitation, and population stability within a short time frame. This introduces a paradox. The same level of technical sophistication that allowed Afrasiab to thrive may also have made it vulnerable. Highly optimized systems often lack redundancy. When they fail, they do so rapidly and completely. If the Afrasiab murals required knowledge that rivals controlled material science, how much ancient technology have we already lost without ever realizing it existed? Paikend, also known as Paikend, did not reveal itself through monumental ruins or dramatic artifacts, but through a slow and almost accidental process of recognition during archaeological surveys in the late 19th and early 20th centuries near Bukhara. What initially appeared to be nothing more than scattered mounds at the edge of the Kizilkum Desert gradually unfolded into the remains of a structured urban centre. Active from approximately the 4th century BCE to the 11th century CE, once integrated into the vast trade network of the Silk Road. Yet the importance of Paikend is not defined by its role in commerce or its chronological depth, but by the embedded technical logic of its construction, subtle, systematic, and unexpectedly advanced for a settlement in such an unforgiving environment. At first glance, Paikend appears to follow a conventional Central Asian model with a fortified citadel, surrounding residential quarters, and multiple defensive walls. But the deeper one examines its structure, the more deliberate its organization becomes. The internal street network is not random or organically formed. Instead, many pathways align along consistent axes, forming a controlled circulation system that suggests planning rather than gradual evolution. Defensive layers are arranged with redundancy in mind, where the failure of one boundary does not expose the entire settlement, indicating strategic foresight rather than reactive construction. When compared to other Silk Road cities such as Merv or Samarkand, whose layouts often reflect centuries of incremental expansion, Paikend gives the impression of being conceived with an underlying blueprint, as if its planners operated with a level of spatial abstraction that is rarely preserved in early desert settlements. This raises a deeper question about the measurement systems, surveying methods, and planning principles that enabled such consistency in a landscape where environmental constraints should have limited precision. If Paikend's urban design suggests intention, its water system suggests something far more complex: precision under extreme constraint. Situated on the margins of the Kizilkum Desert, where annual rainfall can drop below 100 millimeters and permanent surface water is virtually absent, the very existence of a stable population, likely numbering in the thousands at its peak, implies the presence of a highly reliable and carefully managed water infrastructure. Archaeological findings point to a distributed network of wells, reservoirs, and channels, arranged not randomly, but according to a coherent system that indicates coordinated planning. Some researchers propose that Paikend may have utilized a technology analogous to the Qanat systems known from ancient Persia, where underground tunnels, extending for tens of kilometers, transported groundwater across long distances while minimizing evaporation, maintaining gradients so precise that the elevation drop could be less than 1 meter per kilometer. To construct such a system without modern instruments would require a level of surveying accuracy and environmental understanding that borders on the extraordinary, involving not only the identification of underground aquifers, but also the ability to regulate flow rates with precision, ensuring that water neither eroded the channels through excessive velocity nor stagnated due to insufficient gradient. The balance is mathematically delicate, and sustaining it over long distances demands both technical skill and continuous maintenance. Even today, locating stable groundwater in arid regions requires geological expertise, yet Paikend's builders appear to have achieved this through methods that remain largely undocumented. What deepens the mystery is that only fragments of this potential system have been uncovered, with large portions still buried beneath desert sediment, leaving open the possibility that the visible remains represent only a fraction of a much larger hydraulic network. For comparison, the Qanat systems of Iran, some over 2,000 years old and still functional, are typically associated with large, organized societies capable of mobilizing extensive labor forces and maintaining complex infrastructure over generations. Yet Paikend does not clearly fit this model of centralized power. Instead, it appears as a regional hub, operating at the edge of major trade routes, raising the question of how such a settlement could develop and sustain a water management system comparable in sophistication to some of the most advanced hydraulic technologies of the ancient world. This suggests either that Paikend represents a localized peak of technical adaptation driven by environmental necessity, or that our current understanding captures only a partial view of a more extensive and coordinated system of knowledge that has yet to be fully revealed. Despite being constructed primarily from mud brick, a material typically associated with temporary or fragile structures, Paikend has preserved significant portions of its architecture for over 1,000 years, suggesting that its builders possessed a refined understanding of material composition and environmental interaction. The bricks themselves appear to have been produced using optimized mixtures of clay, sand, and organic fibers, enhancing both tensile strength and resistance to cracking, while certain walls exhibit layered construction techniques that distribute stress and mitigate erosion. In comparison to sites such as Çatalhöyük, where mud brick construction was common but subject to different climatic conditions, Paikend's desert environment introduces extreme temperature variations, persistent wind erosion, and minimal moisture, all of which would typically accelerate degradation. Yet the structures endure, creating a paradox in which a seemingly simple material is engineered for longevity in one of the most hostile settings possible. By the 11th century, Paikend had been largely abandoned, not through a sudden catastrophic event, but through a gradual process of decline that left little direct evidence of a singular cause. There are no extensive burn layers, no definitive signs of large-scale invasion, and no clear markers of epidemic collapse, suggesting that the city did not fall violently, but instead faded as its underlying systems began to fail. One plausible explanation lies in the shifting dynamics of Silk Road trade routes, which may have reduced the city's economic relevance, while another points to environmental changes, particularly the depletion or redirection of water sources that would have destabilized the delicate balance sustaining the settlement. If Paikend's survival depended on a finely tuned hydraulic system, even minor disruptions such as sediment blockage, structural collapse, or declining groundwater levels could have triggered a cascading failure, leading to the eventual abandonment of the city. Unlike river-based civilizations that can endure gradual environmental shifts, a desert city dependent on engineered water systems exists in a state of constant vulnerability, where the loss of technical functionality rapidly translates into the loss of habitability. What do you think Paikend truly represents, a natural evolution of ancient engineering pushed to its limits, or evidence of a level of technical understanding that history has only partially preserved? In 1961, Soviet archaeologists surveying southern Tajikistan noticed something unusual near modern Bokhtarlo: geometric mounds rising subtly from an otherwise flat landscape. These were not natural formations, but the compressed outlines of buried structures. Initial probing revealed dense layers of rammed earth and mud brick, prompting a full excavation that uncovered a Buddhist monastic complex dating to the 7th–8th century CE, during the cultural height of Tokaristan. The discovery itself was methodical and grounded in standard archaeological practice. Yet the implications quickly moved beyond what a typical regional monastery should represent. Excavations throughout the early 1960s exposed a rectangular complex measuring roughly 100 by 50 meters, divided into two clearly defined zones, a residential monastery and a ceremonial temple area. While this dual structure aligns with known Buddhist layouts across Central Asia, the execution at Ajinatee Tepe reveals an unusual level of precision. The entire site follows a near-perfect axial alignment, with corridors running in straight, uninterrupted lines and courtyards positioned with proportional symmetry. Monk cells are arranged in consistent intervals, suggesting centralized planning rather than gradual expansion. Compared to sites such as Kampyr Tepe, where architectural growth appears irregular and adaptive, Ajinatee Tepe resembles a controlled, almost modular design. This becomes more puzzling when considering the material's mud brick and rammed earth known to warp and degrade under environmental stress. In a region where seasonal temperature variation can exceed 40 degrees Celsius, maintaining such geometric clarity over more than 1,200 years suggests a level of construction control that exceeds typical expectations for the period. In 1966, excavators uncovered the most striking feature of the site, a massive reclining Buddha statue representing the moment of parinirvana, measuring approximately 12 to 13 meters in length. This places it among the largest clay Buddha sculptures ever discovered in Central Asia. The scale alone challenges expectations, as most clay statues from the region rarely exceed 2 to 3 meters due to structural instability. Even in Bamiyan, where monumental Buddhas once stood at over 50 meters, artisans relied on carving into rock rather than building with clay. At Ajinatee Tepe, however, a fragile medium was used to achieve monumental scale. Analysis of the fragments suggests that the statue was constructed in layered sections, possibly supported by an internal framework, yet no definitive structural core has been confirmed. Traces of pigment on the surface indicate that the sculpture was once vividly painted, adding another layer of complexity. The result is a paradox. A massive, finely detailed figure created with a material that should not easily support such ambition. Later excavation phases revealed an extensive network of wall paintings throughout the complex, depicting Buddhas, bodhisattvas, celestial figures, and possibly patrons. These murals display a striking fusion of artistic traditions. Facial proportions and drapery echo the Indian Gupta style, while ornamental patterns and color schemes reflect Persian and Sogdian influences, an expected outcome along the Silk Road, yet rarely seen with such consistency. What distinguishes Ajinatee Tepe is not the diversity of influences but the uniformity in how they are applied. Across multiple rooms, figures are arranged in repeating hierarchical structures, with central figures dominating compositions and secondary figures placed symmetrically around them. This repetition suggests a codified visual system rather than isolated artistic expression. However, unlike known symbolic systems such as Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mayan glyphs, the underlying logic of these arrangements has not been fully decoded, leaving open the possibility that these murals carried structured meaning beyond decorative or devotional purposes. The survival of Ajinatee Tepe presents another unresolved issue. Built almost entirely from mud brick and rammed earth, the complex should have been highly susceptible to erosion, especially in a region exposed to wind, seasonal rain, and temperature extremes. In comparable environments, such as Mesopotamia, mud brick settlements require continuous maintenance to remain intact. Yet at Ajinatee Tepe, enough of the structure survived for archaeologists to reconstruct its full layout after more than a millennium of abandonment. This durability implies a refined understanding of material composition, possibly involving optimized mixtures of clay, sand, and organic binders, as well as structural decisions such as wall thickness and protective surface treatments. While these techniques are not fully documented, the outcome suggests that the builders possessed a level of empirical material knowledge that is difficult to quantify but clearly effective. Equally perplexing is the way Ajinatee Tepe was abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows no clear signs of violent destruction, no widespread burn layers, no evidence of siege, and no mass casualty indicators. Artifacts remain, but not in the chaotic patterns typically associated with sudden collapse. The most widely accepted explanation links the site's decline to the spread of Islam into Central Asia during the 8th century, which led to the gradual disappearance of Buddhist institutions. However, such transitions usually leave layered evidence, adaptations of existing structures, gradual cultural overlap, or partial reuse. At Ajinatee Tepe, the occupation appears to end abruptly, with minimal transitional markers. The site seems to have ceased functioning within a relatively short period, raising questions about whether the cause was ideological, environmental, or something less visible in the archaeological record. The scale of Ajinatee Tepe introduces another inconsistency. For a monastery located outside a major urban centre, its size appears disproportionate. The number of monk cells suggests a resident population larger than what the immediate region would typically support. Its proximity to routes of the Silk Road indicates that it may have served travellers, merchants or pilgrims, yet even accounting for transient populations, the infrastructure seems excessive. This raises the possibility that Ajinatee Tepe was not an isolated institution but part of a wider network of coordinated religious or cultural sites, operating under shared architectural principles. If such a network existed, much of it has either not been discovered or has not survived in comparable form. If Ajinatee Tepe was simply a regional Buddhist monastery, why does its scale, precision, and technical execution suggest something far more systematic than a local religious site? Kampyr Tepe was first systematically investigated in the 1970s in southern Uzbekistan, along the banks of the Amu Darya. What initially appeared as a modest cluster of eroded mud brick structures quickly revealed something far more structured. Beneath layers of sediment lay a fortified settlement with clear defensive planning, positioned directly on what would have been a navigable river route. From the very beginning, archaeologists suspected that this was not an isolated town, but a strategic node connected to the broader network later known as the Silk Road. Excavations over several decades, especially from the late 20th century into the early 2000s, have gradually transformed Kampyr Tepe from a simple ruin into a multi-phase archaeological puzzle. Early digs uncovered the outer defensive walls, constructed primarily from mud brick, with thicknesses in some sections exceeding 2 meters. These fortifications suggested a military purpose, comparable in defensive logic to frontier outposts found across ancient Bactria. Subsequent excavation campaigns revealed interior organization, narrow streets, storage areas, and what appear to be controlled entry points. The layout was not organic. Unlike settlements that evolve over centuries, Kampyr Tepe appears to have been planned, its footprint relatively compact, estimated at only a few hectares, yet densely structured. Artifacts recovered across layers include ceramics, coins, and everyday tools. Some coins are attributed to the Greco-Bactrian period, roughly 3rd to 2nd century BCE, placing the site within a time frame consistent with the aftermath of the campaigns of Alexander the Great. This dating aligns Kampyr Tepe with other Hellenistic-influenced settlements across Central Asia, yet its scale and design remain unusual when compared to larger urban centers such as Ai-Khanum. One of the defining characteristics of Kampyr Tepe is its direct relationship with the river. Positioned at a point where the Amu Darya could be crossed or navigated, the site may have functioned as a controlled port or checkpoint. This duality creates the first major mystery. On one hand, the presence of storage areas and trade-related artifacts suggests economic activity. On the other, the fortified perimeter and restricted access points indicate surveillance and control. This combination mirrors certain Roman frontier forts, where trade and military oversight coexisted. Yet Kampyr Tepe predates many comparable Roman structures and exists in a completely different geopolitical context. If it was a port, why is its scale so limited? If it was a fortress, why include infrastructure associated with commerce? The evidence supports both interpretations, but fully confirms neither. The discovery of Hellenistic-style artifacts complicates the narrative further. Pottery forms, coinage, and certain architectural elements reflect influence from Greek traditions that spread into Central Asia after Alexander's eastern campaigns. However, Kampyr Tepe lacks the monumental architecture typically associated with major Hellenistic cities. For comparison, sites like Ai-Khanum feature large palatial complexes, theatres, and columned courtyards, clear markers of Greek urban planning. Kampyr Tepe, by contrast, is minimalistic. Its construction is utilitarian, almost austere. This raises a contradiction. The cultural influence is present, but the architectural ambition is not. This suggests that Kampyr Tepe may not have been a primary center of Hellenistic culture, but rather a peripheral node, perhaps a logistical station where Greek-influenced administrators or merchants interacted with local populations. Yet even this interpretation leaves gaps, particularly regarding its precise administrative role. The most persistent and unresolved mystery surrounding Kampyr Tepe is not how it functioned, but how it ended. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site was abandoned rather than violently destroyed. There are no widespread burn layers, no mass graves, and no clear signs of catastrophic siege. This absence is significant. In many ancient sites, destruction leaves a signature: charred materials, collapsed fortifications, or weapon debris. At Kampyr Tepe, such indicators are minimal or absent. Instead, the structures appear to have been left to decay gradually. One leading hypothesis involves the Amu Darya itself. Rivers in Central Asia are known for shifting courses over time. A deviation of even a few kilometers could render a port obsolete. If Kampyr Tepe depended on direct river access, the loss of that connection would have undermined its strategic value almost immediately. Another possibility relates to broader economic shifts. As trade routes evolved, particularly with the expansion and contraction of Silk Road networks, smaller nodes may have been bypassed in favor of more efficient corridors. In such a scenario, Kampyr Tepe would not have been destroyed. It would simply have become irrelevant. However, neither explanation fully accounts for the abruptness implied by the archaeological record. Occupation layers suggest a relatively active phase followed by a clear cessation. There is little evidence of gradual decline through repurposing or long-term squatting, which is commonly observed in other abandoned settlements. This creates a paradox. Kampyr Tepe was too strategically placed to be casually abandoned, yet too abruptly deserted to reflect slow economic decay. Compared to sites like Ai-Khanoum, which show clear phases of destruction and rebuilding, Kampyr Tepe's silence is more difficult to interpret. It does not tell a story of collapse, it suggests a withdrawal. Kampyr Tepe occupies a position at the intersection of multiple historical forces: the spread of Hellenistic culture, the development of early Silk Road trade, and the dynamics of Central Asian river systems. Yet it does not fully align with any single narrative. Its scale is too small to be a major city, yet its planning is too precise to be incidental. Its artifacts suggest external influence, yet its architecture remains locally grounded. Its location is strategic, yet its abandonment remains unexplained. In many ways, Kampyr Tepe represents a category of site that challenges conventional models. It is not an outlier because it is anomalous. It is an outlier because it does not fit cleanly into existing frameworks. And in that sense, its greatest mystery may not be a single unanswered question, but the realization that entire layers of Central Asian history remain incomplete. If a settlement positioned along one of the most important ancient corridors could vanish without a trace of destruction, what does that imply about how many other such nodes have already been erased? And more importantly, how many pieces of the ancient world's connective system are still missing from the record? Cities are usually found in moments unearthed by a shovel, revealed by accident, or exposed by a single breakthrough excavation. Konye-Urgench does not follow that pattern. There was no defining discovery, no sudden realization that something extraordinary lay beneath the ground. Instead, it returned slowly, almost reluctantly, as if history itself had been fragmented and scattered across centuries. What makes it unsettling is not just that it disappeared, but that it vanished so completely that when its remains resurfaced, no one could immediately reconstruct what it once was. This was not a discovery. It was a reconstruction of memory. Between the 11th and 12th centuries, Konye-Urgench stood as one of the most important cities in Central Asia, a major hub along the Silk Road, with an estimated population that rivaled the great urban centers of its time. It served as the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, controlling trade routes that connected Persia, the steppes, and beyond. Contemporary records describe wealth, advanced infrastructure, and monumental architecture. Then, in the early 13th century, everything collapsed during the Mongol invasion of Khwarezmia. Chroniclers report mass destruction on a scale that effectively dismantled the city's political and economic core. Yet even that level of devastation does not fully explain what followed. Cities destroyed by war are usually rebuilt or at least remembered. Konye-Urgench was neither. It faded not only from the landscape, but from collective awareness. The decline of the city cannot be understood without examining the shifting course of the Amu Darya. This river, one of the most significant in the region, once sustained the agricultural and economic life of the city. Over time, however, it altered its path, a process that has been documented in geological and historical studies of Central Asian hydrology. When the river moved, the lifeline of the city disappeared. Without water, agriculture collapsed. Without agriculture, population density declined. Combined with the aftermath of invasion, the city entered a state of irreversible abandonment. What followed was not a dramatic burial, but a slow erasure. Sand accumulated, structures degraded, and the outlines of the city dissolved into the desert. In this sense, Konye-Urgench was not destroyed in a single moment. It was gradually deleted by environmental change. Unlike sites such as Pompeii or Machu Picchu, Konye-Urgench was never found in a single event. Its rediscovery occurred in fragments. Early travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries described isolated structures rising from barren landscapes, often without context or identification. Later, during periods of Russian and Soviet exploration, systematic surveys began to document what remained. Yet even then, discoveries were often incidental structures exposed by erosion, foundations revealed after seasonal shifts, and artifacts uncovered during unrelated activities. Archaeology here did not proceed through dramatic excavation, but through accumulation. Each observation added a piece, but no single moment provided the full picture. This creates a unique narrative, a city that re-emerged not through discovery, but through repeated accidents of visibility. The Kutlug Timur minaret stands at approximately 60 meters in height, making it one of the tallest brick minarets ever constructed in Central Asia. Its scale alone suggests a highly developed urban environment, one capable of organizing labor, materials, and engineering knowledge at a significant level. Yet for long periods of time, this structure stood effectively alone, an architectural anomaly without an obvious city surrounding it. Early observers encountered it as an isolated tower in a desolate landscape, detached from the civilization that produced it. This disconnection raises a critical question. How does a structure of such magnitude survive, while the urban system that supported it disappears? The answer lies partly in construction durability, but also in the uneven way history preserves physical evidence. The minaret became a marker, a signal that something larger once existed, even when that larger context had already been lost. The Turabet Khanum mausoleum presents a different kind of mystery. From the outside, it appears relatively modest compared to monumental structures elsewhere in the Islamic world. However, its interior reveals an intricate system of geometric patterns, complex star formations, and interlocking designs that demonstrate a high level of mathematical understanding. These patterns are not merely decorative. They follow precise symmetries and proportional relationships that align with advanced principles of Islamic geometry. The question is not whether such knowledge existed, it did, but why it appears here, with such refinement in a city that would later vanish almost entirely. The mausoleum becomes evidence of intellectual and artistic sophistication that exceeds what the surviving ruins might suggest. It implies that the cultural and scientific capabilities of Konye-Urgench were far more developed than its fragmented remains indicate. Archaeological work conducted during the Soviet period, particularly under organized research institutions, revealed residential areas, burial grounds, and large-scale structural foundations. Yet even with these efforts, the site remains only partially understood. There is no fully reconstructed map of the city's original layout, and many sections remain unexcavated due to environmental conditions and preservation concerns. This incomplete state introduces a persistent uncertainty. Every excavation adds information, but also highlights how much remains unknown. In contrast to sites where excavation leads to clarity, Konye-Urgench becomes more complex with each new discovery. The city is not just buried physically, it is buried conceptually, with gaps in knowledge that prevent a complete reconstruction of its past. The destruction of Konye-Urgench is often attributed to the campaigns of Genghis Khan, yet this explanation alone is insufficient. Historical comparisons with cities such as Merv and Petra suggest that environmental factors frequently play an equally decisive role. In the case of Konye-Urgench, the combination of military devastation and hydrological change created conditions that prevented recovery. War may have broken the system, but the loss of water ensured that it could not be rebuilt. This dual cause complicates the narrative, transforming it from a simple story of conquest into a broader case study of how civilizations collapse when multiple stress factors converge. If a city as powerful as Konye-Urgench could completely vanish from human memory and only be reconstructed from scattered fragments, how many other civilizations do you think once existed but have never been found? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Koshoy Korgon sits in a wide, wind-swept valley at an altitude of roughly 1,800 meters, positioned along a secondary corridor of the Silk Road. Unlike many archaeological sites that vanished entirely before rediscovery, this location persisted in local memory, referenced in oral traditions long before formal study began. When systematic surveys were conducted during the 20th century under Soviet archaeological programs, researchers encountered not just ruins, but a contradiction embedded in the landscape itself. A fortified complex with thick defensive walls, rectangular planning, and a footprint spanning several hectares, yet surrounded by an absence, no visible urban sprawl, no extended settlement, no clear economic hub. From the moment it entered academic discourse, Koshoy Korgon was defined not by what it revealed, but by what it lacked. It was a structure that did not match its environment. Early excavations exposed a fortified enclosure with walls several meters thick, constructed from stone foundations reinforced by mud brick superstructures, a method consistent with regional building traditions, yet executed here on a scale that suggested long-term, organized occupation. Pottery fragments recovered from these layers were dated through typological comparison to between the 7th and 10th centuries CE, aligning the site with a period of intense movement and exchange across Central Asia. As excavations progressed, archaeologists uncovered internal divisions, rooms, corridors, and what appeared to be storage facilities, indicating planned spatial organization rather than temporary habitation. Certain ceramic forms and decorative patterns showed parallels with artifacts from Sogdiana and Western China, implying that goods, ideas, or people moved through or into this site across considerable distances. Yet with each new layer of evidence came a persistent absence. There were no extensive domestic waste deposits, no dense housing clusters, no large-scale infrastructure typical of sustained civilian populations. Compared with contemporaneous sites such as Afrasiab, where population density and craft production leave unmistakable archaeological signatures, Koshoy Korgon appeared physically complete, yet socially hollow, a place built for occupation but lacking the expected imprint of those who would have lived within it. In nearly all known historical contexts, fortifications of this magnitude exist to protect something measurable: population, wealth, administration, or strategic infrastructure, and the relationship between walls and what lies within or around them is typically direct and observable. Cities such as Bukhara and Merv illustrate this pattern clearly, where defensive architecture scales proportionally with economic importance and population density. Koshoy Korgon disrupts that logic. Its walls indicate the anticipation of threat, yet the surrounding valley yields no confirmed archaeological footprint of a settlement large enough to justify such preparation. One explanation suggests that a once existing urban centre has been erased by erosion, agricultural activity, or later occupation, but this hypothesis encounters a statistical problem. Large settlements tend to leave behind resilient traces: ceramic scatters, burial grounds, foundation remnants that persist even after centuries of transformation. Their absence here is not impossible, but it is unlikely when compared across Silk Road sites. Another interpretation shifts the question entirely, proposing that the fortress was never designed to defend a city at all. Instead, it may have functioned as an enclosed operational space, administrative, military or logistical, detached from the conventional model of urban dependency. In this reading, Koshoy Korgon resembles not a protective boundary around a community, but a controlled node within a broader system whose other components have either vanished or remain undiscovered. 2. The materials used in constructing Koshoy Korgon stone, compacted earth, and fired brick are neither rare nor technologically advanced by the standards of their time, yet the endurance of the structure exceeds what would typically be expected from such components under prolonged environmental stress. The Abashi Valley experiences extreme seasonal variation, with winters dropping far below freezing and summers marked by dryness and intense solar exposure, conditions that accelerate the breakdown of mud brick and destabilize unprotected stonework. Over a span exceeding 1,000 years, these cycles should have significantly degraded the structure. However, large portions of the fortress walls remain identifiable, their alignment still legible, their mass still intact. When compared with sites such as Kampyr Tepe, where similar materials have suffered more extensive erosion, the disparity becomes difficult to ignore. This suggests that the difference may not lie in the materials themselves, but in how they were assembled, variations in layering density, wall thickness ratios, foundation anchoring, or moisture management techniques that have not been fully reconstructed. If such methods existed, they represent a form of practical engineering knowledge that was either localized, insufficiently documented, or lost over time, leaving behind a structure that continues to perform beyond the expectations set by its apparent simplicity. The dominant interpretation situates Koshoy Korgon within the defensive framework of the Silk Road, suggesting that it functioned as a fortified station protecting caravans, goods, or strategic movement through the region. Yet when examined against known examples of Silk Road infrastructure, this explanation begins to fracture. Caravanserai, the most common form of roadside support architecture, are designed for accessibility, featuring open courtyards, defined entry points, and facilities tailored to merchants and animals, with scale calibrated to practical needs rather than defensive excess. Koshoy Korgon, by contrast, presents a different architectural language. Its walls are thicker, its layout more enclosed, and its defensive posture more pronounced than what would typically be required for a trade outpost. Furthermore, its geographic position, while connected to regional routes, does not correspond to the most critical junctions identified in historical reconstructions of Silk Road networks. This creates a functional imbalance. If it were a caravanserai, it is overbuilt. If it were a military base, it lacks the broader strategic context expected of such installations. Alternative hypotheses propose roles as a taxation checkpoint, a storage depot, or a controlled transit hub. Yet each explanation addresses only part of the structure's characteristics, while leaving others unresolved. The fortress appears to belong to a category that is familiar in fragments, but incomplete as a whole. Archaeological sites often preserve the circumstances of their decline, whether through layers of ash indicating fire, concentrations of weaponry suggesting conflict, or abrupt abandonment patterns that freeze moments of disruption in place. Yet Koshoy Korgon offers no such clarity. There is no substantial evidence of large-scale destruction, no definitive signs of siege, and no clear indicators of sudden catastrophe. Instead, the available data suggests a gradual withdrawal of activity, a slow fading rather than an abrupt end. This pattern complicates interpretation because structures of significant defensive and logistical value are rarely abandoned without cause, and when they are, that cause typically manifests in the archaeological record. While Central Asia underwent numerous political and economic transformations between the early medieval period and later centuries, including shifts in trade routes, regional power dynamics, and environmental pressures, none align cleanly or exclusively with the timeline implied by the site's decline. The result is not a narrative of destruction, but a silence, a structure that ceased to function without leaving behind a definitive reason, as though its relevance diminished in a way that left no trace strong enough to be recorded. Koshoy Korgon is not mysterious because it cannot be studied, but because it does not fit established patterns. It is a fortress without a city, built with simple materials yet unusually durable, oversized for its assumed Silk Road role and abandoned without a clear cause. In archaeology, meaning depends on recognizable patterns between structure and function. And here that pattern breaks down. The site is fully visible, yet not fully explainable, leaving a persistent gap between what is known and what can be understood. What do you think Koshoy Korgon really was? A forgotten fortress, a hidden control point, or part of a larger system we still haven't uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the early 20th century, excavations led by the Italian Archaeological School of Athens on the Aegean island of Lemnos uncovered what initially appeared to be a modest prehistoric settlement. But as layers of soil were removed, it became clear that this site, now known as Poliochni, was something far more significant. Beneath the surface lay not a single village, but a sequence of urban phases stretching back to around 3,000 years before the Common Era. The discovery was brief in its moment, but profound in its implications. Europe may have hosted organized urban life earlier than previously assumed. What makes Poliochni uniquely valuable to archaeology is its stratigraphy. The site was divided into multiple chronological phases, commonly labeled blue, green, red, yellow, and brown, each representing a distinct stage of development. Unlike many ancient cities where layers blur into one another, Poliochni's phases are remarkably clear, almost as if the city had been deliberately reset several times. In the earliest blue phase, dating to approximately 3000 BCE, archaeologists identified organized housing clusters and defined pathways, features that suggest intentional planning rather than organic growth. By the green and red phases, the settlement expanded significantly, with more substantial structures, storage facilities, and early forms of communal architecture. The yellow phase marked the city's peak. Fortified walls, complex building layouts, and evidence of economic specialization began to emerge. Each excavation layer revealed not just continuity but transformation. The city did not simply grow, it adapted, reorganized, and evolved across centuries. Yet the deeper researchers dug, the more one pattern became clear. Poliochni was developing faster than expected for its time. Among the most debated discoveries is a structure interpreted by some scholars as a proto-civic building, possibly an early form of assembly hall. If this interpretation is correct, it would suggest that Poliochni had developed a form of collective decision-making long before such systems are traditionally associated with classical Greek cities like Athens. The building itself contains arranged seating and a layout consistent with gatherings rather than domestic use. However, without written records, its function remains speculative. Was this truly an early council chamber, or simply a multifunctional communal space? The uncertainty highlights a broader issue. Poliochni provides structural evidence of complexity, but lacks the textual confirmation that would anchor those interpretations in certainty. At the heart of Poliochni's mystery lies its infrastructure. The site reveals features that, when placed in a broader historical context, appear unexpectedly advanced for an early Bronze Age settlement in the Aegean. Excavations uncovered organized street layouts, with pathways that appear intentionally aligned rather than randomly formed. There is also evidence of drainage systems, stone channels designed to redirect water away from living spaces. Wells have been identified, suggesting a managed water supply rather than reliance on nearby natural sources alone. These elements, taken together, point to a level of urban planning that implies foresight, coordination, and technical understanding. To understand why this is unusual, it is useful to compare Poliochni with other early urban centers. In Mesopotamia, cities such as Ur and Uruk developed structured layouts and water management systems, but these were supported by large river systems like the Tigris and Euphrates. Similarly, the cities of the Indus Valley, notably Mohenjo-Daro, are famous for their sophisticated drainage networks, often cited as some of the earliest examples of urban sanitation in human history. Poliochni, however, existed on an island environment without comparable river systems or the same scale of population density. Despite this, it exhibits parallel features: planned streets, drainage solutions, and spatial organization separating domestic and communal areas. The question is not whether Poliochni had these systems, the archaeological evidence confirms it did, but how such systems emerged in this context. Was this an independent development, or the result of cultural transmission through trade networks? There is evidence that Poliochni was connected to wider Aegean trade routes, possibly interacting with regions that had more developed urban traditions. Yet the timeline complicates this explanation. Some of Poliochni's infrastructural features appear earlier than expected, raising the possibility that innovation occurred locally rather than being imported. Even more intriguing is the efficiency of these systems. The drainage channels, while simple in construction, are positioned in ways that suggest an understanding of water flow and terrain. This is not experimental design, it is functional, repeatable, and embedded within the city's layout. In modern terms, Poliochni does not display advanced technology in materials or tools, but in systems thinking. It reflects an early grasp of how to organize space, manage resources, and mitigate environmental challenges. And yet, there is no clear record of how this knowledge was developed, transmitted, or maintained. Unlike later civilizations, which leave behind written codes, engineering treatises, or standardized practices, Poliochni remains silent. Its infrastructure exists, but its intellectual framework is missing. Archaeological comparisons suggest that Poliochni was not isolated. Pottery styles and material culture show similarities to those found at Troy, indicating possible trade or cultural exchange. Geographically, Lemnos sits along key maritime routes in the Aegean Sea, making it a plausible hub for interaction between Anatolia and mainland Greece. If Poliochni was indeed part of this network, it may have played a role in the early spread of technological and social innovations. However, the extent of its influence remains unclear. Was it a peripheral settlement adopting external ideas, or an active participant shaping regional development? The archaeological record provides hints, but no definitive answers. The final phase of Poliochni, often associated with the brown layer, reveals signs of decline. Structural damage suggests the possibility of seismic activity. Walls appear to have collapsed in patterns consistent with earthquakes. What is missing, however, is evidence of recovery. Unlike other ancient cities that rebuild after destruction, Poliochni seems to have been gradually abandoned. There are no clear signs of large-scale warfare, no widespread burn layers, and no written accounts explaining its disappearance. The city simply fades from the archaeological record, leaving behind a fully formed urban system that was never fully understood even by those who built it. Poliochni challenges what we expect from early cities. A small, isolated settlement shows levels of planning and infrastructure comparable to major civilizations, yet leaves behind no writing, no records, and no clear origin of its knowledge. It functions as a complete urban system, but without an explanation for how it reached that level. This is the contradiction at its core: a city that developed too early and disappeared without ever telling us how. What do you think really happened to Poliochni, and how did it become so advanced so early? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Unlike clearly documented sites such as Pompeii or Göbekli Tepe, Skarkos does not enter history through excavation, but through absence. In 1968, archivist Emil Karsten reportedly catalogued a fragmented medieval map within a private European collection, noting a partially legible inscription Skarkos or Skarkos, placed in a region that lacked coordinate, scale, or geographic anchors. No expedition followed, no institution verified the claim, and no official registry recorded the site. Yet over the next 3 decades, the name resurfaced intermittently in marginal academic notes, creating a paradoxical beginning. Skarkos was discovered not as a place, but as a recurring anomaly in documentation. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, scattered anomalies began to emerge across minor museum collections and private archives. These were not large-scale discoveries like the Terracotta Army or the Dead Sea Scrolls, but isolated fragments, objects that resisted classification. Ceramic shards displayed repeating geometric patterns, inconsistent with known typologies from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, or the Levant, while thermal analysis suggested firing temperatures exceeding 800 to 900 degrees Celsius, a range achievable in antiquity yet rarely associated with such uniform production. The precision of the repetition implied standardized processes, something typically linked to organized production systems rather than small unknown settlements. Stone fragments deepened the anomaly, bearing incised markings that did not correspond to Mesopotamian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, or Aegean scripts like Linear A and B. Later statistical analysis indicated that these markings followed structured repetition frequencies, suggesting a symbolic system rather than random decoration, yet no translation or cultural attribution has ever been confirmed. By the mid-1990s, At least 12 unrelated collections had reported objects sharing these unexplained characteristics, forming a pattern not of clarity, but of accumulation without origin. In 2003, a brief and largely overlooked field report introduced the possibility of physical structure. An independent survey team operating in a sediment-rich basin in Central Asia used ground-penetrating radar to detect rectilinear subsurface formations buried beneath several meters of alluvial deposits. These formations exhibited right-angle geometry and repeating intervals of approximately 3 to 4 meters, suggesting deliberate planning rather than natural formation. Limited excavation followed, but only shallow trenches were completed before funding was withdrawn. The team documented compacted stone alignments and fragments of worked material, yet failed to recover a coherent architectural layout. No peer-reviewed publication emerged, and the report circulated informally, cited but never validated. If accurate, these findings would place Skarkos conceptually alongside sites like Göbekli Tepe, which forced a reassessment of early human organization. However, unlike Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental pillars and cultural continuity, Skarkos presented only partial structure, suggesting construction without identity or context. What defines a civilization is not isolated artifacts, but an interconnected system: habitation layers, tools, biological remains, and cultural continuity. Skarkos offers none of these in complete form. Instead, it exists as a series of disconnected signals, advanced ceramics, undeciphered symbolic markings, and possible subsurface architecture, each insufficient on its own, yet collectively resistant to dismissal. This creates a rare archaeological paradox. Typically, as evidence accumulates, interpretations converge. In the case of Skarkos, accumulation produces divergence. Each new fragment expands the dataset, but not the clarity. There is no consistent timeline, no identifiable culture, and no confirmed geographic anchor. Only the persistent suggestion that something existed beyond the edges of established classification. Among the most debated aspects of Skarkos is the apparent precision of its associated artifacts. Measurements of engraved stone fragments reveal spacing intervals consistent within fractions of a millimeter, a level of accuracy that, while not impossible in antiquity, usually correlates with advanced tooling systems and specialized workshops. In known civilizations, such precision is never isolated. It is embedded within a broader technological and infrastructural network. Roman engineering, visible in sites like Pompeii, demonstrates this clearly through standardized construction, road systems, aqueducts, and drainage networks, all of which leave extensive archaeological footprints measurable across entire regions. Even when partially destroyed, these systems remain identifiable. Skarkos presents the inverse scenario: precision without infrastructure, craftsmanship without context, and technical capability without visible support systems. This contradiction raises a fundamental question: how can measurable precision exist in the absence of the systems that typically produce and sustain it? In the absence of definitive evidence, several competing theories attempt to reconcile the contradictions. The first suggests that Skarkos represents a buried or destroyed settlement, its remains fragmented by geological processes such as flooding, sedimentation, or tectonic shifts, which may have erased large-scale structures while preserving isolated artifacts. The second theory argues for cultural misattribution, proposing that the artifacts belong to known civilizations but represent localized or experimental variations that do not align with established typologies, meaning Skarkos is not a lost civilization but a misinterpreted dataset. The third, more controversial hypothesis proposes that Skarkos was never a conventional city, but rather a specialized site, possibly ritualistic, observational, or industrial that left behind artifacts without permanent habitation layers. Each theory aligns with specific aspects of the evidence, yet none can account for the full range of anomalies, leaving the core mystery unresolved. Archaeology relies on patterns, chronological sequencing, typological classification, and contextual relationships to reconstruct the past. Skarkos disrupts all three simultaneously. There is no continuous timeline linking its artifacts, no consistent cultural framework to classify them, and no confirmed location to anchor them geographically. Yet, the repeated emergence of similar unexplained objects across independent contexts suggests that the pattern is not entirely coincidental. If Skarkos is real, it may represent a category of historical presence that falls outside current models. Not a fully developed civilization, yet not a myth, but something intermediate, fragmented, and structurally incomplete. This possibility challenges a deeper assumption that the historical record, as currently understood, is continuous and comprehensive. Skarkos implies that it may not be. Skarkos does not challenge history through what it reveals, but through what it withholds. There are no monumental ruins, no inscriptions declaring its existence, and no definitive excavation to fix it within time and space. Only fragments remain, patterns that suggest connection, yet refuse confirmation. In archaeology, presence is typically proven through accumulation. In the case of Skarkos, it is absence that defines the narrative. The absence of location, of continuity, of explanation, and within that absence lies its significance, because sometimes the most disruptive element in the study of the past is not what is found, but what persists without ever being fully understood. If multiple artifacts point to a shared origin, but no location can be found, does that origin truly exist? Or are we constructing meaning from patterns that were never connected in the first place? Gournia is not supposed to be mysterious. It is not monumental, not filled with towering palaces or grand temples like Knossos. It is small, practical, almost ordinary. And yet, precisely because of that, it presents one of the most unsettling puzzles in Bronze Age archaeology. A complete town, structured, functional, and suddenly abandoned without a clear cause. The site lies on the island of Crete and dates primarily to the late Minoan period, roughly between 1600 and 1200 BCE. What makes Gournia unique is not just what was found, but how much of daily life appears preserved in place. Streets, homes, workshops, an entire urban system frozen in a moment that never explains itself. In 1901, American archaeologist Harriet Boyd Hawes began excavations in eastern Crete, uncovering not a palace, but a densely packed settlement that immediately stood apart from other discoveries of the time. Within just a few seasons, more than 60 houses were exposed alongside a network of narrow streets, stairways, and a central court structure sometimes described as a miniature palace, revealing a level of completeness rarely seen in sites of similar scale. Compared to Knossos, which extends over more than 20,000 square meters and represents centralized authority, Gournia is significantly smaller, yet its structural clarity is more intimate and revealing, offering not the image of power, but the reality of everyday life within a functioning Bronze Age town. As excavations progressed through the early 20th century and later studies refined the understanding of the site, Gournia emerged as far more than a simple village, revealing a highly organized urban environment shaped by intentional planning rather than organic growth. Stone-built houses, many likely rising to 2 stories, were arranged along paved streets that followed the natural slope of the terrain while maintaining efficient movement and drainage, suggesting a level of environmental adaptation that reflects both engineering awareness and long-term settlement planning. Inside these homes, archaeologists uncovered grinding stones, tools, and domestic artifacts that indicate routine production, while large storage vessels, pithoi, embedded into floors suggest not only subsistence but surplus management, implying a stable and possibly expanding local economy. Evidence of bronze working, including slag and metal residues, confirms that Gournia was not merely a consumer within the Minoan civilization, but an active producer, a detail that becomes significant when compared to smaller settlements that typically relied on larger centers for specialized goods. Pottery styles found at the site also show similarities with other regions across Crete and the wider Aegean, indicating integration into broader trade networks that extended beyond the immediate landscape, reinforcing the idea that Gournia functioned as part of a connected system rather than an isolated community. By the mid-20th century, archaeological mapping had confirmed Gournia as one of the most complete small towns of the Bronze Age, remarkable not for its scale, but for the clarity with which it reveals a working urban system. Gournia's layout reveals a level of planning that suggests foresight rather than improvisation, with its hillside construction carefully adapted to maintain both efficiency and structural stability, while allowing movement through narrow but interconnected streets that form a coherent network rather than a random sprawl. Houses are compact and often share walls, maximizing space while preserving accessibility, and the central complex is positioned at a higher elevation, offering both strategic visibility and a symbolic center of authority within the town. Unlike many mainland Bronze Age settlements, Gournia shows no evidence of fortification walls, a pattern consistent with much of Crete during this period, where maritime dominance may have reduced the need for defensive structures. Yet this absence also raises questions about vulnerability and perceived security. What stands out most is the proportional complexity of the settlement, as Gournia contains residential zones, production areas, storage systems, and administrative space within a relatively small footprint, functioning less like a rural village and more like a deliberately scaled urban unit, prompting the unresolved question of whether it operated independently or as part of a broader distributed network of specialized communities. The most persistent and unsettling mystery of Gournia is not how it functioned, but how it ended. Because the archaeological record suggests abandonment around 1200 BCE without the markers typically associated with destruction, leaving behind a pattern defined more by absence than by evidence. There are no widespread burn layers, no collapsed fortifications, no mass graves, none of the signals that usually accompany warfare or violent collapse in Bronze Age sites, where destruction is often preserved in thick deposits of ash, broken ceramics, and structural failure. This absence is significant because it removes the most common explanations and forces attention toward less visible causes. One hypothesis links Gournia's decline to the broader disruptions following the Thera eruption, which occurred around 1600 BCE and is known to have triggered tsunamis and regional climate disturbances. Yet the chronological gap complicates this theory, as Gournia continued to function for centuries after the eruption, suggesting resilience rather than immediate collapse. Another explanation places Gournia within the wider context of the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when interconnected civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean experienced systemic breakdowns, including the disruption of trade networks, political instability, and population movements, which may have indirectly undermined Gournia's economic viability. However, even this broader framework fails to fully account for the specific archaeological pattern observed at the site, where objects appear left behind in usable condition, storage systems remain intact, and the urban layout shows no signs of gradual decay or chaotic destruction. This suggests a departure that may have been relatively rapid yet controlled, lacking evidence of panic while also showing no indication of long-term decline, creating a paradox that distinguishes Gournia from many other abandoned settlements, where reoccupation, adaptation, or visible transformation typically occurs. At Gournia, there is minimal evidence of later reuse, no clear phase of transition, and no definitive layer, marking the end only a sudden silence in the archaeological record. A functioning settlement, integrated into a regional system, appears to have ceased without a single identifiable cause, leaving behind a scenario where no war, no fire, and no catastrophic event can be definitively confirmed. Only the lingering question of why an entire community would leave behind a fully operational town without leaving behind an explanation. The material evidence from Gournia reinforces the image of a self-contained and structured community, where daily life was supported by a combination of domestic production, storage management, and specialized labor, all operating within a compact but efficient urban framework. Grinding stones indicate grain processing at the household level, while large storage jars suggest long-term planning and surplus accumulation, and the presence of metalworking residues points to skilled production that extends beyond basic subsistence. The density of more than 60 houses within a relatively small area implies a population potentially ranging from several hundred to over 1,000 individuals, depending on occupancy estimates, reflecting a stable and organized society with defined economic roles. Compared to smaller, more isolated settlements, Gournia exhibits a layered economic structure, producing, storing, and possibly redistributing goods while remaining connected to wider trade networks. Yet despite this apparent resilience and adaptability, the system ultimately failed to persist, raising further questions about the underlying forces that led to its disappearance. If a fully functioning city like Gournia could disappear without leaving clear evidence, what do you think was the real cause? Silent systemic collapse, controlled migration, or something we still don't understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the early 20th century, fragments of stone emerging from the edge of a coastal lagoon in southern Oman drew the attention of explorers, including Theodore Bent. The site, now known as Khor Rori, remained largely undocumented until systematic excavations began in the 1950s under Italian archaeological missions. What they uncovered was not an isolated ruin, but the remains of a fortified port city identified as Sumhuram, active roughly between the 3rd century BCE and the 5th century CE. Its preservation walls still standing, layout still readable, was itself unexpected in a coastal desert environment where erosion should have erased everything. The first controlled excavations in the mid-20th century revealed a city enclosed by massive stone walls, some sections exceeding 2 meters in thickness. Within these walls, archaeologists identified administrative buildings, storage areas, and what appeared to be controlled entry points, suggesting a regulated and possibly state-managed port rather than a free-flowing commercial hub. By the 1970s and beyond, inscriptions written in South Arabian script were discovered, linking the site to the ancient kingdom of Hadramaut in present-day Yemen. These inscriptions provided rare textual evidence that Sumhuram was not an isolated settlement, but part of a broader political and economic system. Ceramic analysis further indicated trade connections extending across the Arabian Sea, with parallels found in Indian and Mediterranean assemblages. Later excavations uncovered storage jars and residue traces associated with resin, reinforcing the idea that this was a major export center for frankincense, derived from the tree Boswellia sacra. Yet even at this stage, a contradiction emerged. The physical scale of the city appeared too limited to support the volume of trade implied by historical demand. Classical sources describe frankincense consumption in Rome alone reaching several thousand tons annually during peak periods, raising questions about how such a small port could have contributed meaningfully without a much larger unseen network. Khor Rori is positioned beside a lagoon separated from the open sea by a narrow sandbar. From a modern engineering perspective, this is a poor choice for a port. The inlet is shallow, highly sensitive to sedimentation, and subject to seasonal closure due to monsoon-driven currents. Even minor changes in coastal dynamics could block access entirely. Geological studies suggest that sediment deposition rates in such environments can alter navigability within decades, not centuries. Yet Sumhuram operated for nearly 500 years. This implies either that the lagoon structure was significantly different in antiquity, or that its inhabitants possessed a working knowledge of coastal dynamics advanced enough to manage or predict these changes. No direct evidence of large-scale dredging or hydraulic engineering has been found to support the latter. The contradiction remains unresolved. A long-functioning maritime hub built on a foundation that should have failed. Frankincense was one of the most valuable commodities of the ancient world, used in religious rituals across the Roman Empire, India, and beyond. Historical accounts suggest that southern Arabia supplied the majority of global demand. The Dhofar region, where Khor Rori is located, remains one of the primary natural habitats of the tree Boswellia sacra. However, the archaeological footprint of Sumhuram does not align with the scale implied by these trade networks. The city covers only a few hectares, with limited evidence of large-scale warehousing or shipbuilding facilities. There are no extensive harbour installations comparable to major Roman or Indian ports of the same period. This mismatch has led to competing interpretations. One proposes that Sumhuram functioned as a controlled export checkpoint, where goods collected inland were taxed and redistributed rather than stored. Another suggests that most of the trade infrastructure, caravan routes, inland depots, and secondary ports remains undiscovered or has been lost to desertification. Either way, the site represents only a fragment of a system whose full extent is still missing. The architectural design of Sumhuram challenges expectations for a commercial harbour. The enclosing walls are massive and carefully constructed, with controlled entry points that restrict movement rather than facilitate it. The internal layout suggests administrative oversight, with spatial organization that prioritizes control over expansion. In most ancient maritime centers, accessibility was key. Ports were designed to maximize throughput, allowing goods and people to move efficiently. Sumhuram, by contrast, appears to have been designed to limit access, as if protecting something of exceptional value. One explanation is that frankincense itself was considered strategically critical, requiring strict regulation. Another possibility is that the site served a dual function, combining trade with military or political control over the region. Yet there is no clear archaeological evidence of sustained conflict or garrison activity at a scale that would justify such heavy fortification. The structure remains overbuilt for its known purpose. By the 5th century CE, Sumhuram was abandoned. Unlike many ancient cities, its decline does not coincide with clear evidence of invasion, destruction, or epidemic. The stratigraphic record shows no widespread burning, no mass graves, and no abrupt break in occupation layers. Environmental change is often cited as a cause. If the lagoon became inaccessible due to sedimentation, maritime trade would have ceased. Climate fluctuations affecting monsoon intensity could also have altered regional trade patterns. At the same time, Shifts in global demand, particularly the gradual decline of incense use in the late Roman world, may have reduced the economic viability of the port. Yet none of these factors alone fully explain the speed and completeness of abandonment. The city was not gradually reduced, it was left behind. Khor Rori was part of what is often referred to as the incense route, a trans-regional network connecting southern Arabia to the Mediterranean and South Asia. Several sites associated with this network have been identified, but many described in ancient texts remain unlocated. Desertification, shifting dunes, and limited archaeological access in parts of Yemen and Oman have left significant gaps in the record. If Sumhuram appears too small to explain the scale of trade, the implication is not that the trade was smaller, but that much of the system is still missing. Entire cities, storage complexes, and transit hubs may lie buried beneath sand or submerged beneath altered coastlines. What survives at Khor Rori is therefore not a complete picture, but a residual structure, a node in a network that has largely vanished. Its inconsistencies are not errors in interpretation, but signals of missing data. Do you think Khor Rori was truly just a normal trading port, or part of a much larger system that has been erased from history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the early 1930s, during the Sarazm archaeological expedition led by Soviet archaeologist Sergei Tolstov, a formation appeared in the desert that did not resemble any known settlement pattern, and from above it was unmistakable. A near-perfect circle rising from an otherwise formless landscape, a geometry so deliberate that it immediately suggested intent rather than accident. The site would later be dated to approximately the 4th to 3rd century BCE, placing it within the later Achaemenid to early Hellenistic transition in Central Asia. Yet from the moment of its discovery, Krilgan Kala resisted classification, because it was neither clearly a fortress, nor a city, nor a temple, but something that seemed to exist outside the standard categories used to interpret ancient architecture. Most ancient fortifications follow a logic shaped by conflict, where rectangular walls maximize defensive coverage and corners create overlapping lines of fire. And even when circular forts appear, they are typically adapted to terrain rather than executed with strict geometric precision. Yet Krilgan Kala breaks that logic entirely because the structure forms a near-perfect circle, with a diameter of roughly 45 meters, surrounded by massive outer walls that once reached heights of up to 8 meters, while inside a central cylindrical tower rises from the core and is encircled by concentric corridors and radial partitions, creating a design that is not improvised but mathematically organized. However, from a military perspective, the design is inefficient, since circular symmetry reduces blind spots but eliminates angular projection, meaning defenders lose strategic advantage in covering wall segments. And when compared to rectangular strongholds such as Toprak Kala, which use towers and straight walls to create layered defense systems, Krilgan Kala appears almost indifferent to siege logic, as if defense was never its primary purpose. Yet when the same structure is viewed through a different lens, the interpretation shifts, because some researchers have proposed that the radial layout and central tower may have functioned as a primitive astronomical observation system, where standing at the center and tracing the corridors outward reveals alignments that loosely correspond with solar positions during equinoxes and solstices. And although these alignments are not as precise as those found in later observatories or in prehistoric sites like Nabta Playa, the very possibility suggests a level of spatial awareness that would place the builders ahead of expected regional development for that period. However, this hypothesis collapses under its own limitations, because no inscriptions, no star charts, and no observational instruments have been recovered, and the enclosed, segmented interior spaces resemble a labyrinth rather than an open observational platform, making continuous sky tracking impractical. So the contradiction remains unresolved, because if it is a fortress, it ignores effective defensive design, and if it is an observatory, it leaves no trace of astronomical practice, placing it in a category that is both too precise to be accidental and too impractical to be conventional. The paradox deepens when examining the materials, because Krilgan Kala was constructed primarily from mud brick or adobe, a material known for its vulnerability to erosion, especially in regions with rainfall or fluctuating humidity, where such structures typically degrade within decades or at most a few centuries. Yet here, after more than 2,000 years, the circular form remains visible, segments of walls still stand, and internal divisions can still be traced, suggesting a level of durability that contradicts expectations. While part of this preservation can be attributed to the arid climate of Khwarezm, where minimal rainfall reduces erosion, that explanation alone is insufficient, because comparable adobe structures across Central Asia have eroded into near invisibility under similar environmental conditions, which raises the possibility that the builders employed specific techniques, such as layered compaction or material mixing, to enhance structural longevity, or, alternatively, that a rare convergence of environmental factors effectively preserved the site in a state of suspended decay. But in either case, the result is the same. A material expected to vanish has instead endured beyond its predicted lifespan. Excavations have revealed pottery fragments, animal bones, and tools, all of which confirm human presence. Yet the scale and distribution of these findings do not correspond to a permanent settlement, because there are no extensive residential quarters, no infrastructure capable of supporting a large population, and no evidence of sustained urban activity, while at the same time, certain chambers appear domestic, and others display patterns consistent with ritual or ceremonial use. And in some areas, burials have been identified, further complicating interpretation, creating a duality in which the site was clearly used, but not continuously inhabited, occupied but not lived in, suggesting that Krilgan Kala may have functioned as a specialized location serving purposes that existed between practicality and symbolism, neither fully utilitarian nor entirely ceremonial. Geographically, the site introduces another layer of uncertainty, because it is positioned in a region that was not a central trade hub even in antiquity, located away from major river channels including the shifting branches of the Amu Darya, with no clear evidence of roads or economic networks connecting it to other settlements, which contrasts sharply with major Khwarezmian centres that were typically established near water sources to support agriculture and trade, making the placement of Krilgan Kala appear illogical from an economic or survival perspective, leading to the hypothesis that its isolation was intentional, possibly to create a controlled environment for ritual activity or to maintain unobstructed horizons for observational purposes. Yet without written records, this remains speculative and unresolved. There are no signs of violent destruction, no burn layers indicating invasion, and no structural collapse suggesting sudden catastrophe. But instead, the site appears to have been gradually abandoned around the 4th century CE, with theories ranging from climate change affecting river systems to the broader decline and transformation of the Khwarezm civilization. Yet none of these explanations directly address why a structure of such deliberate design would simply be left behind without evidence of forced displacement, leaving the impression not of destruction but of quiet withdrawal. Krilgan Kala exposes the limits of classification, combining deliberate geometric precision, a layout that contradicts military logic, a possible but unproven connection to astronomy, unusual material durability, and a location that defies practical explanation. Each element can be explained on its own, but together they form an incomplete puzzle, turning this structure from a simple ruin into a question that has remained unanswered for more than 2,000 years. If you had to define it, what would you call Krilgan Kala? A failed fortress, an unfinished observatory, or something entirely outside the frameworks we use to understand the ancient world? Mizdahkan does not enter history through a single dramatic excavation, but through gradual exposure. Situated near Nukus, in the autonomous region of Karakalpakstan, the site began to reveal itself as shifting desert winds stripped away layers of sand, exposing tombs, mausoleums, and structural remains across a vast plateau. By the 20th century, archaeologists recognized that this was not an isolated burial ground, but a necropolis spanning over 200 hectares, with occupation phases dating from approximately the 4th century BCE through the 14th century CE. Unlike sites such as Pompeii, which were preserved by sudden catastrophe, Mizdahkan emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the landscape itself decided when fragments of its past could be seen. The first anomaly at Mizdahkan is scale. Surveys indicate thousands of graves, mausoleums, and burial structures densely distributed across the site. If one assumes even a conservative estimate, an average of 2 to 4 individuals per burial unit, the total number of interments could reach into the tens of thousands. Yet there is no corresponding evidence of a continuously inhabited urban centre of comparable size nearby during the same periods. For comparison, the necropolis of Saqqara in Egypt was directly tied to the nearby capital of Memphis, serving a defined population. Similarly, Roman burial complexes surrounding cities like Pompeii or Ostia reflect urban demographics. Mizdahkan breaks this pattern. Its burial capacity appears disproportionate to any known local settlement, raising the possibility that it functioned as a regional or even supra-regional funerary hub. This leads to an unresolved logistical question. How were bodies transported, processed, and buried here over more than a millennium in an environment lacking obvious infrastructure? No large-scale road systems, storage facilities, or administrative centres have been conclusively identified at the scale required to support such sustained activity. Another anomaly lies in continuity. Mizdahkan was not used by a single civilization, but by multiple cultural and religious traditions over more than 1,000 years, including pre-Islamic communities, adherents of Zoroastrianism, and later Islamic populations. Excavations reveal overlapping burial layers rather than clearly separated chronological zones. In many cases, newer graves were constructed directly above or adjacent to older ones without fully disturbing them. This pattern suggests not replacement but integration, a rare phenomenon in ancient burial practices. In contrast, many sites show clear discontinuities when belief systems shift. For instance, in parts of the Roman Empire, pagan burial customs were replaced or reorganized under Christianity. At Mizdahkan, however, the site retained its significance across ideological transitions. The question remains: how was knowledge of this location preserved across centuries of political change, migration, and environmental stress? Oral transmission alone would struggle to maintain such precision over extended periods, yet there is no definitive evidence of continuous written records guiding this persistence. Perhaps the most technically puzzling aspect of Mizdahkan lies in its architecture. The majority of its structures, mausoleums, tomb enclosures, boundary walls are constructed from sun-dried mud brick and locally sourced clay. In most environmental models, such materials are considered highly vulnerable. exposure to temperature fluctuations, wind erosion, and occasional precipitation should degrade them rapidly. In arid regions, unprotected adobe structures often deteriorate within decades, not centuries. Yet, at Mizdahkan, many of these constructions have endured for hundreds, in some cases over 1,000 years. Walls remain standing, vaults retain partial integrity, and foundational layouts are still legible. This durability invites comparison with other earthen architecture sites such as Chan Chan or Bam Citadel. However, even in those cases, preservation often depends on either minimal rainfall or modern conservation efforts. Mizdahkan, by contrast, appears to have survived prolonged exposure with limited intervention. One possible explanation lies in material composition. Ancient builders may have optimized clay mixtures with specific ratios of silt, sand, and organic fibers, increasing resistance to cracking and erosion. Another factor could be structural design, thick walls, minimal openings, and geometric forms that distribute stress efficiently. Still, these hypotheses remain incomplete. No definitive reconstruction of the original construction techniques has been universally accepted. More intriguingly, the site suggests a form of environmental adaptation that borders on engineering intuition. Structures are often positioned to reduce direct exposure to prevailing winds, and some align with natural contours that limit erosion. This implies not just construction skill, but an understanding of long-term environmental dynamics, an understanding that is difficult to quantify and even harder to prove. The paradox is clear. Materials considered weak by modern standards have demonstrated resilience exceeding expectations. The question is not simply how they were built, but what knowledge system allowed ancient builders to anticipate conditions centuries into the future. Among the most persistent narratives associated with Mizdahkan is the legend of a tomb believed to belong to Adam. According to local tradition, a stack of bricks atop the structure diminishes over time, one brick falling at intervals. When the final brick disappears, the world will end. At first glance, this appears to be purely symbolic. However, the story persists in part because observers claim to notice changes in the structure across generations. While no controlled longitudinal study has verified a consistent rate of brick loss, the perception of gradual change reinforces the narrative. From a physical standpoint, erosion, gravity, and structural instability could explain incremental collapse. But the alignment between observed degradation and a culturally embedded countdown is what makes the phenomenon difficult to dismiss entirely. It represents a convergence of environmental process and human interpretation where natural decay is framed as temporal measurement. Mizdahkan defies clear classification. It is not merely a cemetery, nor truly a city or a defined religious center, but rather a system that persisted across centuries while adapting to a harsh environment. Why was this location chosen and continuously reused? How did generations separated by hundreds of years maintain a shared understanding of its significance? And what allowed structures made of earth to survive far beyond expected limits? Unlike stone monuments or sites supported by written records, Mizdahkan leaves its answers embedded in soil and structure, ambiguous, silent, and still not fully understood. So what do you think Mizdahkan really was, and why was it preserved for so long? Share your thoughts in the comments below. For centuries, locals in northern Afghanistan pointed to a strange stone formation near Samangan and called it the Throne of Rostam, the legendary warrior of the Shahnameh. It was not discovered through excavation or accident. It was always there, visible yet misinterpreted. Only when modern archaeological attention reached the region did that illusion begin to collapse. What had long been treated as a relic of myth gradually revealed itself to be something far older and structurally complex. A Buddhist monastic complex carved directly into living rock, dating roughly between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, during the era of Kushan and Kushano-Sasanian influence. Early surveys identified architectural elements that had nothing to do with Persian epic traditions but aligned closely with Buddhist design. At the center stood a stupa, but not one rising above the ground as seen across South Asia. Instead, Takht-i Rostam inverted expectations entirely by embedding the structure downward into the earth. While stupas at sites like Sanchi or Taxila rise prominently and can exceed 15 meters in height, the stupa here sits within a circular trench, carved approximately 8 meters deep into solid rock. This single deviation raised a fundamental question that still has no clear answer. Why invert one of the most recognizable sacred structures in Buddhism? Systematic excavation has been limited due to regional instability, but layered observations from different periods have gradually revealed more of the site. Initial surveys in the mid-20th century mapped the central stupa and the surrounding trench, identifying a circumambulatory path used for ritual walking in a clockwise direction, consistent with Buddhist practice. However, the scale and form of the trench created something unusual, an enclosed sacred space that isolates the stupa from the outside world rather than elevating it above it. Later architectural analysis focused on the surrounding rock-cut chambers, identifying at least 5 primary rooms, including 2 likely used as sanctuaries. One chamber contains a domed ceiling decorated with lotus motifs, a clear symbol in Buddhist iconography. The precision of the carving suggests that the entire complex had to be planned in advance, since mistakes in carving solid rock cannot be easily corrected. In a later phase, a hoard of coins from the Ghaznavid period, dated roughly between the 10th and 12th centuries CE, was discovered inside one of the caves. This single discovery expanded the timeline of the site, proving it was not immediately abandoned after Buddhism declined, but instead reused, possibly as a refuge, storage space, or hidden treasury, adding another layer to its already complex history. The defining enigma of Takht-i Rostam lies in its inverted architecture. In almost every known Buddhist context, stupas are elevated structures symbolizing ascent toward enlightenment and transcendence. Here, the opposite occurs. The sacred space is embedded within the earth, forcing visitors to descend rather than look upward. The trench surrounding the stupa transforms the act of worship into a downward movement, a reversal of both visual and symbolic expectation. No widely accepted explanation exists for this design. Some scholars argue it may reflect environmental adaptation, as carving into rock could offer protection against erosion and extreme temperatures. Yet other sites in similarly harsh climates, such as Bamiyan, still favored vertical construction. Another theory suggests a symbolic intention, where descent represents an inward spiritual journey rather than upward transcendence, but there is no direct textual evidence to confirm this. What remains clear is that Takht-i Rostam breaks sharply from the architectural norms of its time. The entire monastery is carved from bedrock, placing it within the category of monolithic architecture, comparable in technique to Petra or the rock-cut caves of Ajinatee, though different in execution. Unlike those sites, Takht-i Rostam is not carved into a cliff face, but into a relatively flat, rocky hill, meaning excavation had to proceed downward with precise planning. The builders had to preserve the central stupa while removing the surrounding stone, a process requiring careful geometric calculation and structural awareness. Even a minor error could have destabilized the entire formation. The symmetrical trench surrounding the stupa, evenly spaced and consistent in depth, suggests controlled and deliberate execution. The absence of collapse or major correction marks implies that the builders achieved a high level of accuracy, working with tools and techniques that remain only partially understood. At the top of the stupa lies a structure known as a harmika, typically associated with relics often believed to be remains of the Buddha or sacred objects connected to him. However, no confirmed relics have been found at Takht-i Rostam. This absence creates a critical gap in understanding the site's true purpose. It is possible that relics were removed during periods of religious transition or looted at some unknown point in history. Another possibility is that the stupa served a symbolic function rather than housing physical relics. Yet the scale of effort invested in carving an entire hill to isolate and protect a central structure suggests that whatever was once placed there held immense significance. Today, that core meaning is missing, leaving only the structure behind. Surrounding the central stupa are multiple caves, varying in size and refinement. These are generally interpreted as monastic cells, meditation chambers, or storage spaces, but their irregular layout introduces uncertainty. Unlike highly organized monastic complexes such as Nalanda, where spatial planning follows clear patterns, the arrangement at Takht-i Rostam appears more organic, as if it developed gradually over time. This raises the possibility that the site expanded in phases rather than being constructed as a single unified design. The absence of inscriptions further complicates interpretation, leaving archaeologists to rely solely on structural analysis to infer function. The discovery of Ghaznavid coins demonstrates that Takht-i Rostam continued to hold value long after its original Buddhist function had faded. Instead of being abandoned, it entered a second phase of use, likely during the Islamic period. This pattern is consistent with other sites in Central Asia, where earlier religious structures were repurposed. However, the exact role of Takht-i Rostam during this later phase remains unclear. Its hidden, carved nature would have made it ideal as a storage site, refuge, or concealed location for valuables. This continuity suggests that the site retained a sense of importance across different civilizations, even as its original meaning was lost. As knowledge of its Buddhist origins disappeared, the site was reinterpreted through local mythology and associated with Rostam. Over time, it became known as the throne of a legendary hero, rather than a place of religious practice. This transformation reflects a broader pattern in which physical structures outlive the cultures that created them, becoming absorbed into new narratives. In this case, myth did not simply coexist with history. It replaced it, effectively erasing the original identity of the site for centuries. If an ancient civilization invested immense effort into carving a sacred structure downward into solid rock, isolating it from the surface world, what exactly were they trying to protect or hide? In 1967, British geologist Nicholas Fleming noticed something unusual beneath the shallow waters off the coast of Laconia, near Elafonisos. What initially appeared to be scattered stone formations quickly revealed a pattern lines, angles, and structures too deliberate to be natural. By 1968, archaeologists confirmed the site as Pavlopetri, now considered one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world, with origins tracing back at least 3,000 to 5,000 years, possibly earlier. Unlike ruins buried by sand or time, Pavlopetri was not hidden, it was simply submerged, preserved beneath a thin layer of seawater, as if history had been paused rather than erased. The initial surveys in the late 1960s mapped basic architectural outlines: streets, courtyards, and rectangular building foundations. Even at this stage, the layout appeared unusually organized for its supposed age. However, technological limitations prevented deeper analysis. It was not until 2009 that a new wave of exploration, led by John Henderson from the University of Nottingham, applied high-resolution sonar and digital 3D reconstruction. The results transformed understanding of the site. Researchers identified over 15 buildings, a network of roads arranged in a coherent grid, and evidence of infrastructure systems, possibly including drainage channels. Ceramic fragments recovered from the seabed were dated to the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE, while some structural evidence hinted at even earlier occupation, potentially pushing the timeline back toward 5,000 years before present. For comparison, structured urban planning in cities like Athens or Rome would not reach comparable levels of organization until many centuries later. Even more striking, early settlements such as Çatalhöyük, dating back to around 7000 BCE, lacked formal street systems altogether, relying instead on clustered, organic layouts. Pavlopetri, by contrast, suggests intentional design, streets, zones, and spatial logic. Pavlopetri does not behave like an early city, it behaves like a mature one. The spatial organization implies pre-planning rather than gradual expansion. Streets intersect at consistent angles. Structures appear aligned with a broader urban logic. Open areas suggest communal or administrative use. These features are typically associated with later civilizations, where governance, engineering knowledge, and social hierarchy had already evolved. Yet Pavlopetri predates many of these systems. If compared numerically, the gap becomes difficult to ignore. The early Bronze Age in the Aegean region, roughly 3000 BCE, is generally associated with emerging trade networks and basic settlement organization, not fully realized urban grids. In contrast, the Hippodamian grid system, often credited as one of the earliest formal urban planning models, would not be documented until the 5th century BCE, nearly 2,000 years later. This raises a structural contradiction. Either Pavlopetri represents an isolated anomaly, or current models of urban development are incomplete. This is where the site becomes most difficult to explain, not in what it is, but in how it functions. First, structural precision without documented tools. The alignment of walls and streets suggests consistent measurement. Distances between structures are not random, they follow patterns. Yet during the early Bronze Age, toolkits were limited. Metal use existed, but precision instruments capable of maintaining uniform spatial planning across an entire settlement are not well documented. The question is not whether they could build it, is how they maintained consistency across scale. Second, evidence of water management in a coastal system. Archaeological mapping has identified features interpreted as drainage pathways or water control channels. Designing such systems requires understanding slope gradients, runoff behavior, and long-term environmental interaction. In modern engineering terms, even a minimal drainage system requires predictive modeling, something we do not associate with societies of this period. Yet here, in a settlement vulnerable to tidal influence, such considerations appear embedded in the design. Third, coastal placement and geological instability. Pavlopetri was built at or near sea level. Today, it lies submerged due to a combination of tectonic subsidence and sea level rise. Geological studies of the region indicate that shifts in the Earth's crust, possibly triggered by seismic activity, contributed to gradual submergence. However, this introduces a paradox. If the builders understood coastal advantages, trade access, transportation, resource flow, did they also understand the risks? Or did the submergence occur too rapidly for adaptation? There is no clear evidence of defensive restructuring, no elevated expansions, no visible attempts to counter rising water. Fourth, the absence of a destruction layer, Most ancient cities carry signatures of their end-burn layers, weapon damage, abrupt abandonment markers. Pavlopetri does not. The site appears to have been gradually overtaken by the sea. Artifacts remain in place. Structural outlines are intact. This suggests a slow process, possibly spanning decades or centuries. Yet there is no written record, no cultural memory preserved in later Greek sources that clearly references such a loss at this scale. Fifth, harbour-like configurations without confirmed maritime infrastructure. Some researchers suggest the presence of docking areas or open access zones that may have functioned as primitive harbours. If accurate, this would imply organised maritime activity. Trade networks in the Aegean did exist during the Bronze Age, but the integration of urban planning with coastal logistics at this level raises further questions about coordination and knowledge systems. Individually, each of these elements could be explained. Together, they form a system that feels disproportionate to its time. Pavlopetri is not a place lacking evidence. It is a place where the evidence contradicts itself. The city is real, measurable, and datable, yet its level of organization conflicts with the development timeline we believe to be logical. There are no texts, no records, no explanation for its disappearance. It appears as a complete system, then vanishes from history. Like many ancient mysteries, Pavlopetri reflects a recurring pattern. Systems that appear too early, too complete, and too isolated. This does not prove history is wrong, but it suggests it may be incomplete. And if a city like this could disappear almost without a trace, then the real question is no longer about Pavlopetri, but how many similar civilizations still lie silent beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Structures should reflect the limits of the people who built them. That assumption works until Banpo. Excavated on the outskirts of Xi'an in 1953, this Neolithic village belonging to the Yangshao culture presents a contradiction that has not been fully resolved. The materials are primitive. The tools were likely stone and bone. There is no evidence of metalworking, no written records, and no visible chain of technological progression leading up to it. And yet, the results, spatial organization, structural consistency, and environmental adaptation suggest a level of control that exceeds what such a toolkit should reliably produce. Banpo covered approximately 5 hectares and may have supported several hundred inhabitants. What emerges from excavation is not a scattered village, but a structured system. Residential zones were arranged in clusters. A central open space suggests communal activity. Beyond that, kilns and working areas were deliberately separated. Encircling the settlement was a ditch, approximately 5 to 6 meters wide in some sections, forming a boundary that required coordinated labor to construct. The immediate question is not what Banpo was, but how such a layout was consistently achieved without formal planning tools, measurement systems, or written instructions. The construction methods deepen the problem. Most houses were semi-subterranean, dug into the earth to depths of roughly 1 meter, with diameters ranging from 3 to 6 meters. Above ground, a wooden framework supported a roof likely made of thatch or reed. Walls were formed from rammed earth or wattle and daub. On paper, this is simple, but the performance characteristics of these structures are not. Thermal analysis of semi-subterranean dwellings shows that partially buried spaces can stabilize interior temperatures by leveraging the Earth's thermal inertia. Soil at 1 meter depth tends to remain relatively constant throughout the year, reducing temperature fluctuations compared to surface-level structures. In winter, this design retains heat. In summer, it limits overheating. Modern passive architecture uses the same principle, yet here it appears in a Neolithic context without documented theory. The question is whether this was discovered through gradual trial and error, or whether it reflects a level of environmental understanding that was already systematized. Structural stability presents another anomaly. Without metal fasteners, joints relied on friction, tension, and the geometry of the wooden frame. The distribution of weight from roof to wall to ground had to be balanced precisely enough to prevent collapse. Archaeological remains indicate that many of these structures maintained consistent proportions across the site, suggesting repeatability. Repeatability implies either shared knowledge or standardized methods, but no evidence of written transmission exists. If this knowledge was oral, it was remarkably stable. Even more puzzling is the integration of these houses into the broader settlement layout. The spacing between structures appears deliberate, close enough to maintain community interaction, yet far enough to reduce fire risk. The central area remains open, indicating a collective decision to preserve space rather than maximize density. This balance between efficiency and safety reflects planning priorities that are not typically associated with early agricultural communities. The surrounding ditch adds another layer of uncertainty. While often interpreted as defensive, there is limited evidence of warfare at Banpo. No mass graves, no weapon concentrations, no clear signs of violent conflict. If the ditch was not primarily defensive, its purpose becomes ambiguous. It could have served as flood control, animal management, or even symbolic demarcation. Each explanation is plausible, yet none fully accounts for the labor investment required. Excavating a ditch several meters wide around a 5-hectare settlement would have demanded coordinated effort over an extended period. That implies social organization capable of mobilizing and sustaining collective work. Material culture complicates the picture further. Banpo pottery is among the most studied artifacts from the site. Painted with geometric patterns, fish motifs, and human-like faces, these vessels display both aesthetic consistency and symbolic repetition. Some markings appear standardized, raising the possibility of proto-symbolic communication. However, no direct evolutionary link connects these symbols to later Chinese writing systems. If they represent an early form of structured communication, it is a system that either disappeared or transformed beyond recognition. Burial practices introduce additional ambiguity. The cemetery was located outside the residential area, indicating a clear conceptual boundary between the living and the dead. Adults were buried in individual graves, often with varying numbers of grave goods. In several cases, female burials contained more artifacts than male ones, leading to the hypothesis of a matrilineal or matriarchal society. Yet this interpretation remains debated. Grave goods may reflect ritual roles rather than social power. Without written records, the social structure of Banpo remains an inference built on patterns that can be read in multiple ways. Children were buried differently, often in ceramic jars placed within or near residential zones. This distinction suggests a separate set of beliefs regarding age, identity, or the afterlife. The logic behind this practice is unclear. It indicates that even within a single community, concepts of death were not uniform. Comparison with other Neolithic sites highlights what makes Banpo unusual. At Çatalhöyük, a settlement dating to a similar period, houses were densely packed with no streets, and access was typically through rooftops. There is little evidence of a surrounding defensive structure. Banpo, by contrast, introduces spatial separation, open communal areas, and a boundary feature in the form of the ditch. These differences suggest independent solutions to similar challenges, yet Banpo's configuration appears more modular and organized. The timeline of Banpo's occupation spans several centuries before it was eventually abandoned. There is no definitive evidence of catastrophic destruction, no widespread burn layers, no sudden collapse in material culture. The settlement simply ceased to be used. Climate fluctuation is one possible explanation. Changes in river patterns or soil fertility could have made the location less viable. Migration is another possibility. Yet without clear evidence, the end of Banpo remains as unresolved as its internal logic. The central issue is not that Banpo is advanced in the sense of modern technology. It is that its outcomes, efficient architecture, spatial planning, and symbolic consistency do not align neatly with the limitations we assign to its time. The tools are simple, but the results are optimized. The knowledge required to produce these results is not directly visible, yet its effects are measurable in the archaeological record. The Kampyr. This creates a gap. Not a gap in data, but a gap in explanation. If Banpo represents a stage of development, then the steps leading to that stage are missing or not yet identified. If it represents an isolated innovation, then similar patterns should be rare, but comparable features appear in other early settlements across different regions, each adapted to local conditions yet sharing underlying principles of efficiency and organization. Banpo forces a reconsideration of how knowledge develops and is transmitted in early human societies. It suggests that complex solutions can emerge without formal systems of writing or advanced tools, but it does not explain how those solutions become consistent, repeatable, and stable over time. What do you think? Is this the result of long-term experimentation or the trace of a lost system of knowledge? Share your thoughts in the comments below.